Marry a stranger in 7 days or lose everything you've built. That's the choice they gave Ethan Hale. No negotiation, no mercy. Just a judge's ultimatum and a woman he'd never met standing on his porch with a worn leather suitcase and eyes that refused to apologize for existing. They called her an old maid, a charity case, a solution to his problem. But Clara Whitfield didn't come to Iron Creek Ranch looking for rescue. She came looking for respect. And before their first week together ended, Ethan would discover that the greatest threat to his carefully guarded heart wasn't the law, the land, or even the thieves circling his cattle. It was her. If you're ready to see how a forced marriage became the truest love story the Arizona Territory ever witnessed, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin where it all started, with a man who believed he needed no one and a woman who would prove him devastatingly wrong. The Arizona sun beat down on Iron Creek Ranch like a hammer on an anvil, relentless and unforgiving. Ethan Hale stood on the porch of his ranch house, a structure he'd built with his own hands from timber he'd hauled 20 miles, watching the dust cloud approach from the eastern road. 3 riders. He recognized the lead horse, a gray gelding that belonged to Judge Horace Pemberton, the man who held more power in this territory than God himself, or so the judge liked to believe. Ethan's jaw tightened. Official visits never brought good news. He was 28 years old, lean and weathered from 6 years of turning scrubland into something productive. His hands were scarred from barbed wire and rough wood, his face angular and sun-darkened, his eyes the color of storm clouds over distant mountains. He'd learned early that survival meant self-reliance, that depending on anyone else was a luxury that could get you killed, or worse, abandoned. The riders pulled up in a spray of dust and pebbles. Judge Pemberton dismounted with the stiff movements of a man who spent more time behind a desk than in a saddle. He was 50-something, broad in the middle, with mutton chop whiskers gone gray and eyes that missed nothing. "Ethan," the judge said, not bothering with pleasantries, "we need to talk." "Judge." Ethan didn't move from the porch. "Didn't know I had business with the territorial court." "You do now." Pemberton gestured to his companions, his clerk, a nervous young man named Timothy, and a marshal Ethan recognized but had never spoken to. "May we come inside? This concerns the legal status of your property." Every muscle in Ethan's body went rigid. The ranch. Always it came back to the ranch. He'd filed his claim properly, paid what fees existed, worked the land for 6 years without missing a season. But in the Arizona Territory, where the law was still being written and rewritten with each session of distant legislators, property rights could shift like sand in a windstorm. "Speak your piece," Ethan said, still not inviting them in. The judge's expression hardened. "Very well. The territorial legislature has enacted new settlement requirements for land claims over 500 acres. To prevent speculation and encourage stable communities, all claimants must demonstrate permanent residency and establishment of a family household." Ethan's hands curled into fists at his sides. "I live here year-round. This is as permanent as it gets." "A family household, Mr. Hale. That means marriage, a wife, and the clear intention to establish a family." Pemberton pulled a document from his coat. "You have until the end of the month, 30 days from today, to comply. Failure to do so will result in forfeiture of your claim. The land will be re-auctioned." The words hit like physical blows. 30 days, marriage, or lose everything. "That's insane," Ethan said, his voice low and dangerous. "I put 6 years into this land, built every fence, dug every well, broke every horse. This is my land." The law disagrees. The judge's tone wasn't unkind, but it was immovable. "I didn't write it, son. I just enforce it. And between you and me, I think it's a damn fool requirement dreamed up by politicians in Prescott who've never worked a day of honest labor. But it's the law nonetheless." "So find yourself a wife," the marshal added with a shrug. "Can't be that hard. Women are scarce out here. Most would jump at the chance for a working ranch." Ethan's laugh was bitter. "I'm not marrying some random woman just to satisfy a legal technicality." "Then you'll lose the ranch." The judge tucked the document back into his coat. "I'm sorry, Ethan, I truly am, but those are your choices." The 3 men mounted their horses. As they prepared to leave, the clerk, Timothy, cleared his throat nervously. There might be an option, Mr. Hale, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. If you're interested. Ethan's eyes narrowed. What kind of option? Timothy glanced at the judge, who nodded curtly. There's a woman. Came in on yesterday's stage from Philadelphia. Name's Clara Whitfield. She's 26, unmarried, and looking for a fresh start. She's staying at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house in town. Why would a Philadelphia woman come out here alone? Ethan asked suspiciously. Her reasons are her own, the judge said. But Timothy's right. She might suit your purpose. If you're interested, I suggest you don't wait. Word gets around fast in a small town, and there are other men who might find the arrangement beneficial. With that, they rode off, leaving Ethan alone with a choice that felt like no choice at all. He stood on that porch for a long time after they disappeared, staring at the land he'd bled for. The ranch sprawled across 640 acres of high desert and grassland, anchored by Iron Creek, which ran year-round and made the property viable when others had failed. He'd arrived here at 22, running from a past in Texas that had taught him that people left, that love was a weakness, that the only thing you could count on was what you built with your own hands. His father had been a dreamer who lost everything chasing bigger opportunities. His mother had died when Ethan was 12, worn down by poverty and disappointment. By 16, Ethan was on his own, working other men's ranches, learning every hard lesson the frontier had to teach. When he'd filed his claim here at Iron Creek, it had felt like finally, he had something that couldn't be taken away. Now they wanted to take it anyway, unless he married a stranger. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if Ethan had been in any state to notice. He went inside, poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey, and sat at the rough-hewn table he'd made during his first winter here. Marriage. The word sat in his mind like a stone. He'd never seriously considered it. What would be the point? Marriage meant partnership, trust, dependence, all the things that had destroyed his father and broken his mother. Better to stay alone, stay focused, stay in control. But alone meant losing the ranch. He drank the whiskey in one burning swallow and made his decision. Tomorrow, he'd ride into town. He'd meet this Clara Whitfield. And if she was willing, he'd make whatever arrangement was necessary to keep his land. It didn't have to be real. It just had to be legal. The town of Copper Springs wasn't much. A main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, a handful of other businesses, and maybe 200 souls on a busy day. Ethan rode in just after dawn, not wanting to deal with crowds or questions. He tied his horse outside Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, a 2-story structure that had been freshly painted the previous summer. Mrs. Henderson herself answered his knock, a formidable woman in her 50s who ran the boarding house with military precision. "Ethan Hale," she said, her eyes shrewd. "Heard the judge paid you a visit yesterday." News traveled faster than wildfire in a small town. "I'm here to see Clara Whitfield," Ethan said bluntly, "if she's willing to receive visitors." Mrs. Henderson studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Wait here." She disappeared inside, leaving Ethan on the porch. He removed his hat, running a hand through dark hair that needed cutting. His reflection in the window glass showed a man who looked older than his years, sunlines around his eyes, a permanent wariness in his expression. "Mr. Hale?" He turned. The woman standing in the doorway wasn't what he'd expected. Clara Whitfield was tall, nearly 5'8", with a slender build that suggested strength rather than frailty. Her hair was dark brown, pulled back in a practical bun, and her eyes were an unusual shade of gray-green that reminded him of sagebrush after rain. She wore a simple traveling dress in deep blue, well made but not fancy, and she held herself with a stillness that spoke of self-possession rather than shyness. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, but there was something arresting about her face. High cheekbones, a straight nose, a mouth that looked like it didn't smile easily, but might be worth the effort when it did. "Miss Whitfield," he said, suddenly aware of how rough he must look. "I'm Ethan Hale. I own a ranch about 8 miles west of here. I was wondering if we might speak privately." "I know who you are," she said. Her voice was educated, Eastern, but not affected. "Mrs. Henderson told me you might come. We can speak in the parlor." She led him inside to a small, well-appointed room with lace curtains and uncomfortable-looking furniture. They sat across from each other, and for a moment neither spoke. "I assume you know about the new settlement law," Ethan said finally. "I do." Clara folded her hands in her lap. "Mrs. Henderson explained it yesterday when news of the judge's visit reached town. She seemed to think you might be in need of a solution." "That's one way to put it." Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I'll be direct, Miss Whitfield, because I don't see the point in dancing around this. I need to marry someone within 30 days or I lose my ranch. I'm not looking for romance or companionship. I'm looking for a legal arrangement that satisfies the territorial requirements." "I see." Clara's expression didn't change. "And what would I receive in this arrangement?" The question surprised him. Most women, he assumed, would jump at the security of a working ranch, no questions asked. "A home," he said. "Security. Your own space. The ranch house is large enough for separate quarters if you prefer. I'm not—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm not expecting a real marriage, Miss Whitfield. This would be a business arrangement." "Business arrangements require clear terms," Clara said. "What exactly are you offering, and what are you expecting in return?" Ethan hadn't thought this through in detail. "I'm offering you a home and financial security. In return, I need you to go through with a legal marriage ceremony and reside at the ranch long enough to satisfy the law's requirements. After that," he shrugged, "we can revisit the arrangement." "After that you'd what? Divorce me? Annul the marriage?" Clara's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "Mr. Hale, I didn't come all the way from Philadelphia to become a temporary inconvenience in someone else's life." "Then why did you come?" The question came out harsher than he'd intended. Clara was silent for a moment, her gaze steady on his face. "I came because I have nothing left back east except the prospect of being a burden to relatives who've made it clear I've overstayed my welcome. I came because at 26, I'm considered too old for a decent marriage proposal, too educated to be a governess, and too poor to be anything but pitied. I came because the Arizona Territory advertises for settlers, and I thought perhaps here, being an old maid wouldn't matter so much." The honesty in her words caught him off guard. He'd expected excuses or evasions, not this stark truth. "It doesn't matter here," he said quietly. "People out here care more about whether you can work than whether you're married." "Then we have something in common," Claire said. "I can work, Mr. Hale. I can manage household accounts, I can cook, I can tend a garden, I can read and write well enough to handle correspondence and records. What I cannot do is pretend to be grateful for a business arrangement that treats me like a legal formality." Ethan sat back, reassessing. This woman wasn't desperate enough to accept whatever scraps he offered. She had pride, standards, intelligence. It should have made things easier, a clean transaction between two practical people. Instead, it made him uncomfortable. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want honesty," Clara said. "I want to know what I'm walking into. I want assurance that if I agree to this, I won't be treated as hired help or a necessary nuisance. And I want the option to leave if the arrangement becomes untenable, with enough resources to establish myself elsewhere." "That sounds like you're negotiating a business contract. Isn't that what this is?" He couldn't argue with that. "Fair enough. Come out to the ranch, spend a week, no commitment, no marriage, just a trial period. See if you can stand it, see if you can stand me. If you can, we'll go through with the ceremony. If you can't, I'll pay your stage fare to wherever you want to go and enough money to get settled. Either way, you'll know what you're choosing." Clara considered this, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. "1 week, but I have conditions." "Name them." "First, separate sleeping quarters, as you mentioned. Second, I want access to the ranch's financial records. If I'm to be legally tied to this property, I need to know its actual state. Third, I want it understood that I'm not a housekeeper or a servant. If I agree to this marriage, it will be as a partner, even if not in the romantic sense." Every point was reasonable, but each one also represented a concession of control that made Ethan's instincts rebel. He'd run this ranch alone for 6 years. He answered to no one, shared with no one, trusted no one, but he'd lose it all in 30 days if he didn't agree. "Done," he said, standing and extending his hand. 1 week, starting tomorrow. I'll come by at first light with a wagon. Clara stood as well, taking his hand. Her grip was firm, her skin surprisingly calloused for an Eastern lady. "Tomorrow then, Mr. Hale." As he rode back to the ranch, Ethan tried to convince himself this was just another problem solved, another obstacle overcome. But something about Clara Whitfield unsettled him in a way he couldn't name. She wasn't grateful or deferential or easy to dismiss. She met him as an equal, demanded to be treated as one. He'd wanted a simple solution. He had a feeling he'd just agreed to something far more complicated. Clara arrived the next morning with 2 bags and a small trunk that contained, as far as Ethan could tell, mostly books. She wore a practical split riding skirt and a simple blouse, her hair in a thick braid down her back. She looked ready to work, not to be waited on. The ride to the ranch took an hour and a half. Ethan kept the conversation minimal, pointing out landmarks, the bend in the creek where the water ran deepest, the ridge where he'd seen mountain lions, the boundary markers of his property. Clara listened without unnecessary questions, her gaze taking in everything with what seemed like a cataloging attention to detail. When they crested the final hill and the ranch came into view, Ethan watched her face for a reaction. The house sat in a natural bowl of land, protected from the worst winds, with the creek running silver in the morning sun about 200 yards to the south. The main house was solidly built, single-story but sprawling, with a deep porch and shuttered windows. Behind it stood the barn, the bunkhouse, corrals, and various outbuildings. It wasn't fancy, but it was his. Every nail, every board, every fence post. 640 acres, he said, unable to keep a note of pride from his voice. 300 head of cattle, 20 horses, 4 working hands who come during roundup and branding. The house has 4 rooms, main room, kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. The well is 40 feet deep and never runs dry. The creek provides water for the livestock and irrigation for the kitchen garden, if you're inclined to plant one. "It's larger than I expected," Clara said, "and more isolated. Nearest neighbor is 5 miles south. Town is 8 miles east. That a problem?" "No." She turned to look at him. "I'm accustomed to solitude, Mr. Hale." He pulled the wagon up to the house and helped her down. Inside, the main room held a stone fireplace, a long table with 8 mismatched chairs, a worn sofa, and several oil lamps. The kitchen was functional but sparse. A cast-iron stove, a dry sink, open shelves with a minimal collection of dishes and pots. Everything was clean but utilitarian, clearly the domain of a man who saw no point in decoration or comfort beyond the necessary. "This bedroom is mine," Ethan said, gesturing to a door on the left. "That one's yours." He opened the door to the second bedroom, a square room with a bed, a washstand, a wardrobe, and a window facing east. "I'll bring in your trunk." While he hauled her belongings inside, Clara walked through the house slowly, her fingers trailing along surfaces, her eyes missing nothing. When he came back in, she was standing in the kitchen, examining the contents of the shelves. "When did you last have a proper meal?" she asked, without turning around. "I eat fine." "That's not what I asked." She pulled down a mostly empty flour sack, a tin of beans, some coffee, a small container of lard. "Mr. Hale, I can see 6 years of bachelor living in this kitchen. When did you last eat fresh vegetables, fresh bread, anything that wasn't dried, salted, or canned?" "I'm not starving," Ethan said defensively. "No, but you're not thriving either." Clara set the items on the counter. "If I'm to stay here for a week, I'll need to go to town for proper supplies. I'll make a list." "I don't need—" "I do," she interrupted, turning to face him. "If I'm evaluating whether I can live here, I need to see what's possible, not just what you've settled for. Unless you'd prefer I cook nothing but beans and hardtack for the next 7 days?" Ethan opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. What did it matter if she bought food? It was her week to decide. "Fine, make your list. We'll go tomorrow." "Today would be better," Clara said, "unless you have urgent work that can't wait." He didn't, not really. The cattle were spread across summer pasture, the horses were fine, and the repairs he'd planned could wait a day. But he'd been looking forward to showing her the operation, establishing that this was his domain, proving that he didn't need help or input or changes. Instead, he found himself back in the wagon 3 hours after arriving home, riding to town with a list Clara had written in neat, precise handwriting. At the general store, she moved through the aisles with purpose, selecting flour, sugar, salt, yeast, eggs, butter, potatoes, onions, carrots, dried apples, canned tomatoes, and a dozen other items. She consulted with the store owner about what was fresh and what was likely to keep, and she tracked every expense on the back of her list. "This is going to cost," Ethan started. "I know what it costs," Clara said calmly. "Food is an investment, not an expense. A well-fed man works better than a malnourished one. Consider it part of the trial period." The store owner, a man named Jacobson who'd known Ethan for years, was watching this exchange with barely concealed amusement. "She's got you there, Hale," Jacobson said with a grin. "Maybe a woman's touch is what that ranch needs." Ethan paid without comment, loaded the supplies, and headed back. That evening, Clara cooked. Ethan sat at the table, pretending to review his account books, but actually watching her move around his kitchen like she'd been there for years. She'd found an apron somewhere in her trunk, tied her hair up in a knot, and set to work with quiet efficiency. An hour later, she set before him a plate of food that made his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't name. Roasted chicken, real mashed potatoes with butter, carrots cooked with a hint of sugar, and fresh bread still warm from the oven. He ate in silence, and it was the best meal he'd had since leaving Texas 10 years ago. "Thank you," he said quietly when he'd finished. Clara, eating her own meal across from him, simply nodded. "You're welcome." After dinner, she washed the dishes while Ethan pretended to work on his books. When she finished, she bid him goodnight and disappeared into her room. Ethan sat alone in the main room, listening to the silence. The house felt different with her in it, fuller somehow, though that made no sense. She was one woman, barely occupying any space, keeping to herself as promised. But the smell of fresh bread lingered. The kitchen was cleaner than it had been in months, and for the first time in 6 years, Ethan Hale went to bed in a house that felt less like a shelter and more like a home. It unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. The next 3 days followed a pattern. Ethan rose before dawn, made coffee, and went out to work, checking fence lines, monitoring water sources, tracking the cattle's movement across the pastures. Clara rose an hour later, cooked breakfast, left a plate for him on the stove, and set about her own work. On the second day, she scrubbed the house from top to bottom, discovering levels of dust and grime Ethan had long since stopped noticing. On the third day, she organized the kitchen and the main room, creating systems where there had been only chaos. On the fourth day, she attacked the kitchen garden plot, a patch of earth behind the house that Ethan had dug out years ago but never actually planted. He watched her from a distance, this Eastern woman in practical clothes, working the Arizona soil with steady determination. She didn't complain about the heat or the hard ground or the isolation. She just worked. That evening, he came in to find her sitting at his table with his account books spread out before her. "Did I say you could look at those?" he asked, more sharply than he'd intended. Clara looked up, unflustered. "You said I could have access to the financial records. These are the financial records. I meant I'd show them to you, not that you'd go through them on your own." "Then you should have been more specific." She turned a page. "Your bookkeeping is atrocious, by the way. You're mixing personal and ranch expenses. You have no system for tracking inventory, and I found 3 instances where you've underpaid yourself for cattle sales, likely because you weren't keeping proper records." Ethan crossed his arms. "The ranch is profitable. That's all that matters." "The ranch is barely profitable," Clara corrected, her finger tracing down a column of numbers. "You're losing money to poor record keeping and what looks like theft. Here, see this? You bought 200 pounds of feed in March, but by your own notes, you only used 120. Where did the rest go?" He leaned over her shoulder, frowning. He'd never thought about it. Feed got used, sometimes faster than expected. "Could have fed more than I wrote down," he said. "Possible. Or someone stealing from you." Clara tapped another entry. Same pattern with salt licks. With medical supplies for the horses. Small amounts, irregular intervals, but it adds up. Over 6 months, I'd estimate you've lost the equivalent of $60 to $80 to either carelessness or theft. $80. That was a month's pay for a working hand. A new horse. Critical supplies for winter. "You figured all that out in one afternoon?" he asked. It's simple arithmetic once you organize the data properly, Clara said. You're good at the physical work, Mr. Hale, but you're terrible at the administrative side. That's costing you. He should have been offended. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. Show me. For the next 2 hours, Clara walked him through the books, reorganizing his system, explaining how to track expenses properly, how to separate personal from business costs, how to identify patterns that might indicate problems. She did it without condescension, treating him as someone capable of learning rather than someone who'd been doing it wrong. You'll need to continue this system, she said finally, closing the last book. 1 hour a week, consistent tracking. It will save you more than it costs in time. Will you teach me to do it properly? The question came out before he'd thought it through. Clara met his eyes. That depends on whether I'm here beyond this week. Right. The trial period. In 3 more days, she'd make her decision. What do you think so far? He asked, genuinely curious. She was quiet for a moment, her gaze moving around the room. The clean kitchen, the organized shelves, the account books now properly sorted. I think, she said slowly, that you've built something worth preserving here. I think you're more capable than you give yourself credit for in some ways, and dangerously stubborn about accepting help in others. I think the isolation would drive some women mad, but I find it peaceful. But? There was a but. He could hear it in her tone. But I don't know if you actually want a partner, Mr. Hale, or if you just want a solution to a legal problem. There's a difference. It was too close to the truth. He'd come to her looking for a legal solution, nothing more. But these past few days had complicated things. She wasn't just solving a problem. She was changing his home, his routines, his way of thinking, and he didn't know if he wanted that change or resented it. I don't know either, he admitted. I've been alone a long time. So have I, Clara said. But there's a difference between being alone by choice and being alone because you're afraid of what partnership might cost. And which one am I? I think you're afraid, she said quietly. I think something or someone taught you that depending on people leads to pain. So you built a fortress out here, and you've been defending it ever since. The insight cut deeper than it should have. Ethan stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. I'm going to check the horses, he said, and left before she could respond. Outside, the night air was cool and clear, the stars brilliant in the unpolluted sky. Ethan walked to the corral, where his gelding, Chance, came over to greet him with a soft nicker. He ran his hand along the horse's neck, trying to settle the turmoil in his chest. She was right. Of course she was right. His father's failures, his mother's death, the long string of disappointments and abandonments, they'd taught him that self-reliance was survival and attachment was weakness. But what if she was wrong about it being fear? What if it was just wisdom, learned the hard way? He stayed out there for an hour, wrestling with questions he'd spent 6 years avoiding. When he finally went back inside, Clara's bedroom door was closed, a line of lamplight visible underneath. He went to his own room and lay awake far longer than usual, listening to the house settle, aware for the first time in years that he wasn't completely alone. On the 5th day, Clara asked to ride out with him to see the cattle. Ethan saddled 2 horses, Chance for himself and Daisy, a steady mare for Clara. He'd expected her to ride side saddle like a proper lady, but she mounted astride with practiced ease. I grew up spending summers at my grandfather's farm in Pennsylvania, she explained, catching his surprised look. I've been riding since I was 6. They rode out to the south pasture where most of the herd was concentrated. The cattle were a mixed lot. Longhorns, some Herefords he'd bought 2 years ago, a few odd breeds picked up at auction. They weren't show animals, but they were hardy and adapted to the terrain. Clara rode beside him in silence, watching the cattle move and graze. After 20 minutes, she spoke. You're missing about 15 head, she said. Ethan's attention snapped to her. What? By my count, there are 283 cattle here. You said you had 300 head. You counted them? He'd been riding this range for years and had never been able to get an exact count while the cattle were spread out. I estimated based on density and distribution, Clara said. I could be off by a few, but not by 17. Either your initial count was wrong or you're missing cattle. Ethan scanned the herd, his jaw tight. He knew his count had been accurate in the spring, which meant Clara was right. He was missing stock. Rustlers, he said grimly. Or natural losses, predators, disease, animals wandering off through weak fencing, Clara suggested. But worth investigating. They spent the next hour riding the fence line. Clara was the one who spotted it, a section where the wire had been cleanly cut and reattached with new wire that didn't quite match the weathering of the rest. Someone's been here, she said, dismounting to examine it more closely. Recently, too. This wire hasn't been exposed to the elements for more than a week or two. Ethan swung down beside her, fury building in his chest. Someone was stealing from him, on his own land. I'll talk to the other ranchers, he said. See if they've had similar problems. Could be a gang working the area. Or it could be someone who knows your routines, Clara said, still examining the fence. Someone who knows when you check which sections, where you're likely to be and when. You think it's someone I know? I think it's worth considering. She straightened, meeting his eyes. You said you hire hands during roundup. Do you trust them? Ethan wanted to say yes automatically, but the truth was, he hired whoever was available and willing to work for fair wages. He'd never had reason to suspect anyone, but he'd also never paid close enough attention to notice if anything went missing. I don't know, he admitted. They repaired the fence with supplies from Ethan's saddlebag and rode back in heavy silence. Ethan's mind was churning. 15 head of cattle, at current market prices, represented a significant loss. If it continued, it could cripple the ranch's profitability. That evening, Clara reorganized his inventory tracking system to include livestock counts by pasture and inspection dates for fence sections. It was meticulous, time-consuming work, but by midnight, they had a baseline. From now on, she said, you check a different section every day, rotating unpredictably. Keep notes on what you see, any signs of disturbance. If there's a pattern to the theft, we'll find it. We? Ethan asked. Clara looked up from the ledger she was updating. If I stay, Mr. Hale, if I agree to this marriage, this ranch's problems become my problems too. I'm not interested in being a passive observer in my own life. It was the most direct she'd been about the possibility of staying. Something in Ethan's chest loosened slightly. 2 more days, he said. Then you decide. Then we both decide, Clara corrected. This arrangement only works if we both choose it. She was right, though he'd been thinking of it as solely her decision. The truth was, he had to choose too. Choose to trust someone, choose to share control, choose to believe that partnership might be worth the risk. He wasn't sure he was ready for that, but he was starting to think he might not have a choice if he wanted to save the ranch and keep Clara Whitfield from walking back into town and out of his life entirely. That night, lying in bed, Ethan admitted something to himself he'd been avoiding for days. He didn't want her to leave, not because she was useful, though she was, not because she solved his legal problem, though she did. He didn't want her to leave because the house felt right with her in it, because she challenged him without making him feel small, because she was the first person in 10 years who'd looked at his life's work and seen not what was wrong with it, but what it could become. And that terrified him more than any legal ultimatum ever could. On the 6th day, Clara spent the morning in the garden while Ethan rode fence lines, following the new system she'd created. When he came back for the noon meal, he found her on the porch, a revolver disassembled on a cloth in front of her. Where did you get that? He asked. From the trunk in the storage room. It's a Colt Navy revolver, old but well made. She was cleaning each piece with careful attention. When was the last time it was properly maintained? I don't know, years maybe. I keep my rifle clean, that's what I use. A rifle is useful for distance, but useless in close quarters, Clara said, reassembling the weapon with practiced hands. If someone comes to the house while you're out on the range, I'd prefer to have a functional sidearm. Ethan sat down on the porch railing, watching her. You know how to use that? My grandfather taught me. He believed women should know how to defend themselves in their homes. But she finished reassembling the gun, checked the action, and nodded with satisfaction. Do you have ammunition for it? He did somewhere. He went to find it, returning with a box of cartridges. Clara loaded the revolver, stood, and walked out to the open area beside the barn. May I? She asked, gesturing to a fence post about 20 yards away. Go ahead. She took a stance, aimed, and fired 3 times in quick succession. All 3 shots hit the post, grouped within a 6-inch circle. Ethan had to work to keep the surprise off his face. Your grandfather taught you well. He said a woman who couldn't defend her home wasn't worth much in frontier country. Clara lowered the gun, ejected the spent cartridges, and reloaded. I may have lived in Philadelphia for the past 8 years, Mr. Hale, but I didn't forget where I came from or what I might need to know. That evening, they sat on the porch as the sun set, sharing a silence that had become comfortable over the past 6 days. Tomorrow was the 7th day, decision day. I've been thinking about your offer, Clara said finally. The terms of this arrangement. Ethan's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. And? I think your terms are inadequate, she said. If I'm to be your legal wife, I need more than separate quarters and access to records. I need a genuine partnership in the running of this ranch. I need my name on the deed as co-owner, not as a dependent spouse. And I need assurance that if something happens to you, I won't be cast off the property by distant relatives or territorial courts. Every word was reasonable, but every word also meant giving up control, sharing power, trusting that she wouldn't use that power against him. That's a lot to ask, he said slowly. It's a lot to give, Clara countered. I'd be yoking my entire future to yours, to this land, to this territory. I'd be giving up any chance of returning east, any possibility of a different life. I think partnership and security are a fair exchange for that. And if I say no? Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then I'll thank you for your hospitality, take the stage fare you offered, and leave in the morning. You'll have 23 days to find another solution. And if I say yes? Then we go into town tomorrow, file the paperwork for the deed, and get married on the 30th day as required by law. She turned to look at him directly. But understand this, Ethan. I won't be a wife in name only, shut away in a separate bedroom like a shameful secret. If we do this, we do it as true partners. That doesn't mean I'm demanding physical intimacy, she added, a faint color rising in her cheeks. But it means mutual respect, shared decision-making, and the understanding that this ranch belongs to both of us. Ethan stared out at the land he'd built alone, the empire of dust and determination that was supposed to prove he didn't need anyone. And he realized that the greatest threat to that empire wasn't the law or rustlers or drought. It was his own stubbornness, his refusal to admit that some things couldn't be done alone. I need to think about it, he said. Clara nodded. Take the night. I'll have my answer ready in the morning as well. Because I need to decide too, Mr. Hale, whether I believe you're capable of true partnership or whether you're just looking for a legal convenience who happens to cook well. She went inside, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the dying light. Ethan sat there for hours wrestling with himself. Everything she asked for was fair, but fair didn't make it easy. His name on a deed shared with another person's. His decisions subject to another person's input. His life intertwined with someone who could hurt him, leave him, prove that his father had been right all along about the foolishness of depending on anyone else. But she'd found his missing cattle. She'd fixed his books. She'd improved his home and his health and his operation in 6 days. What could she do with 6 years? With 60? And more than that, more than the practical benefits, there was the simple fact that he'd slept better this past week than he had in years. That the house felt warmer when she was in it. That he caught himself listening for her footsteps, looking forward to meals, finding excuses to work near the house instead of ranging far into the pastures. That maybe, just maybe, being alone wasn't the same as being strong. Shortly before midnight, Ethan made his decision. He walked to Clara's door and knocked softly. "Come in," she called. He opened the door. She was sitting up in bed, still dressed, a book in her lap. She'd been waiting. "Yes," he said simply. "To all of it. Partnership, shared ownership, everything, on one condition." Clara closed her book. "What condition?" "That you give me time," Ethan said. "Time to learn how to do this. How to be, not alone. I'm going to be bad at it. I'm going to want to make decisions without consulting you, to handle problems by myself, to keep you at a distance because that's what I know. But I'll try. I'll try to be a real partner. Just
Give me time to figure out how. Clara studied his face for a long moment. Then she smiled. The first real smile he'd seen from her, and it transformed her entire face into something luminous. That, she said, is the first truly honest thing you've said to me since we met. Yes, Ethan. I'll give you time, and you'll give me the same. Time to learn this land, to understand this life, to become the partner this ranch needs. We'll go to town tomorrow, Ethan said. File the papers, make it official.
23 days before the wedding, Clara reminded him. That gives us time to prepare to make sure this is what we both want. I want it, Ethan said, and realized he meant it. Not just because of the legal requirement, but because Clara Whitfield had walked into his fortress and somehow made him want to tear down the walls. He reached out his hand. She took it. Partners, he said. Partners, Clara agreed. And in that moment, standing in the doorway of a ranch house in the Arizona Territory, Ethan Hale began to believe that maybe, just maybe, his greatest fear, that love and partnership meant weakness, was wrong. Maybe they meant strength. He'd have 23 days to find out. And after that, a lifetime to prove that the forced marriage everyone expected to fail would become the truest partnership the Iron Creek Ranch had ever known. But first, he had to survive those 23 days, learn to trust, and discover that the woman forced into his life by a judge's ultimatum might just be the person who could save not just his land, but his heart. The morning they rode into Copper Springs to file the deed paperwork, the sky was the color of burnished copper and the air already carried the promise of punishing heat. Clara sat beside Ethan on the wagon bench, her traveling bag at her feet containing the few legal documents she'd brought from Philadelphia: birth certificate, letters of reference, proof of education. Things that mattered back east but meant little out here, where what you could do counted more than who you'd been. The Territorial Land Office was a cramped building that smelled of dust, ink, and old paper. The clerk, a tired-looking man named Morrison who wore sleeve garters and spectacles that constantly slid down his nose, pulled out the necessary forms without comment. He'd clearly seen enough desperate arrangements in this territory to be surprised by nothing. "You'll both need to sign here, here, and here," Morrison said, pushing the papers across the scarred wooden counter. "Miss Whitfield, you understand that by accepting joint ownership prior to marriage, you're entering a legal partnership that will be formalized upon the wedding but exists in provisional form as of today?" "I understand," Clara said, her voice steady. "And Mr. Hale, you understand that you're relinquishing sole ownership and that Miss Whitfield will have equal legal standing regarding all decisions pertaining to the property?" Ethan's hand hesitated over the pen for just a moment. Then he met Clara's eyes and saw the same mixture of hope and wariness he felt himself. "I understand." They signed. Morrison witnessed, stamped, filed, and handed them each a copy of the deed. Just like that, Iron Creek Ranch belonged to both of them. Walking out into the bright sunlight, Clara folded her copy carefully and placed it in her bag. "No going back now," she said quietly. "No," Ethan agreed. "No going back." They made one more stop before leaving town, at the small office of Reverend Calloway, who served as the town's minister, occasional schoolteacher, and keeper of vital records. He was a lean man in his 40s with kind eyes and a pragmatic streak born of watching the frontier teach its harsh lessons to idealists. 30th of the month, Ethan told him. Simple ceremony, no fuss. Reverend Calloway made a note in his ledger, then looked up at both of them with an expression that was part sympathy, part amusement. "I've married 17 couples in this territory, and I can tell you that the ones who start with realistic expectations tend to fare better than the ones who start with romantic illusions. But I've also learned that sometimes the most practical arrangements surprise everyone by becoming something more." "We're not looking for more," Ethan said firmly. "We're looking for legal and fair." "Of course," the Reverend said mildly. "I'll see you on the 30th. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them absorbed in their own thoughts. But when they reached the property line, marked by a cairn of stones Ethan had built his first month here, Clara spoke. "Stop for a moment." Ethan pulled the wagon to a halt. Clara climbed down, walked to the cairn, and stood looking out over the land that now legally belonged to her as much as to him. The wind caught her braid, whipping loose strands across her face. She didn't brush them away. My grandfather used to say that land remembers, she said. Remembers who worked it, who loved it, who bled for it. He said you can't fool land. It knows if you're just using it or if you're committed to it for the long term. Ethan climbed down beside her. What do you think this land remembers? I think it remembers 6 years of one man's determination, Clara said. I think it remembers stubbornness and survival and refusing to quit. Now we'll find out if it can remember partnership too. She turned to face him, and for a moment they stood in the Arizona sun, two people who'd known each other for less than a week, legally bound to land and to each other by paperwork that wouldn't mean anything if they couldn't make it work in practice. I meant what I said last night, Ethan told her. I'm going to be bad at this. So will I, Clara admitted. I've spent 8 years being told I'm too independent, too opinionated, too unwilling to defer to male authority. Those aren't traits that disappear overnight just because I signed a deed. Good, Ethan said, surprising himself. I don't want them to disappear. I want us to figure out how to make those traits work together instead of against each other. Clara smiled, that same transformation of her face that had caught him off guard the night before. Then we're starting from the same place. That's more than most couples have. They climbed back onto the wagon and continued home. But something had shifted between them, some acknowledgement that this venture was as frightening and uncertain for her as it was for him. They were both risking everything on a partnership neither of them knew how to build. The next days fell into a rhythm that was both comfortable and subtly different from the trial week. Clara moved through the house with the confidence of ownership rather than a guest, making small changes that improved function. She rearranged the main room so that the evening light fell better for reading, moved the dish storage closer to the stove for efficiency, and claimed a corner of the kitchen table as her workspace for the ranch accounts. Ethan, for his part, began consciously including her in decisions he would have made automatically before. When he planned to ride out to check the north fence line, he told her first, explaining where he'd be and when he expected to return. When supplies needed ordering, he asked her opinion on quantities and priorities. When he discovered a lame horse, he brought her out to the stable to examine it with him, valuing her different perspective. It felt awkward at first, this constant communication. Ethan had spent 6 years answering to no one, explaining himself to no one. Every conversation about plans or decisions felt like surrendering control, and his instinct was to resist. But Clara never wielded her new authority like a weapon. She asked questions, offered suggestions, and accepted his expertise in areas where he clearly knew more. When they disagreed, which happened more often than Ethan had expected, she stated her position clearly and listened to his, and they worked toward compromise rather than dominance. 3 days after filing the deed, they had their first real argument. Ethan had decided to hire 2 seasonal hands to help with a major fence repair project. He'd worked with both men before, drifters who showed up during roundup season, worked hard for fair wages, and moved on. He'd already sent word to town that they should report to the ranch the following Monday. Clara found out when she was reviewing the accounts that evening and saw Ethan's notation about wages to be paid. You hired Tom Fletcher and Jim Dawson, she said, her tone carefully neutral. Yeah, good workers, both of them. We need help with the fence repairs if we're going to stay ahead of the rustling problem. Tom Fletcher was one of your crew during last spring's roundup? That's right. Clara pulled out the inventory record she'd reorganized, flipped to a specific page, and turned it toward Ethan. Tom Fletcher was here from March 15th to April 20th. During that time, you noted discrepancies in feed supplies, salt licks, and medical supplies. The same discrepancies I pointed out to you last week. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. You think Tom's stealing from me? I think the timing is suspicious enough to warrant consideration before you hire him again. Tom's worked for me 3 seasons. He's never given me reason to doubt him. Because you weren't tracking inventory closely enough to notice if he did, Clara said, her voice still calm but with an edge of steel. Ethan, I'm not saying he's definitely stealing. I'm saying we should verify before we invite him back onto the property. And I'm saying I know these men, and I trust my judgment of character. Your judgment that didn't notice $80 worth of losses over 6 months? The words stung because they were true. Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping loud in the quiet room. I've been running this ranch successfully for 6 years without your help. I think I can manage hiring decisions.
Clara stood as well, her gray-green eyes steady on his face. This ranch belongs to both of us now, which means hiring decisions affect both of us. If Tom Fletcher is stealing, he's stealing from me too. I have a right to voice concerns. Voicing concerns is different from vetoing my decisions. I'm not vetoing anything. I'm asking you to wait, to investigate before you bring someone onto our property who might be robbing us blind. Our property, Ethan repeated, the words bitter in his mouth. 5 days of shared ownership, and you're already trying to override me. Clara's expression hardened. Don't do that. Don't make this about control when it's about common sense. If you want to ignore evidence because it's inconvenient, that's your choice. But don't pretend I'm being unreasonable for pointing out what your own records show. She picked up the ledger, tucked it under her arm, and walked to her bedroom, closing the door with deliberate gentleness that was somehow worse than slamming it. Ethan stood alone in the main room, anger and shame warring in his chest. She was right. He knew she was right. The evidence was there in black and white, and his resistance wasn't about Tom Fletcher's character. It was about not wanting to admit he'd been blind, not wanting to accept that Clara had seen in a week what he'd missed in years. It was about fear that if he admitted she was right about this, he'd have to keep admitting she was right about other things. And eventually, there'd be nothing left of his independence, his control, his carefully constructed walls. He slept poorly that night, listening to the silence from the other side of the house, and hating that the silence bothered him. In the morning, Clara was up before him, which almost never happened. She'd made coffee but no breakfast. When he came into the kitchen, she was sitting at the table with the ledgers again, her face composed but her eyes tired. I'm riding out to check the south pasture fence, Ethan said stiffly. I'll be back by noon. I'll come with you, Clara said, standing. You don't need to. I want to. Her tone left no room for argument. Give me 10 minutes to change. They rode out in tense silence. The morning was cooler than usual, clouds building to the west that might mean rain later. Ethan focused on the fence line, checking posts and wire with meticulous attention, aware of Clara riding beside him but not looking at her. It was Clara who spotted the first problem, another section of cleanly cut and repaired fence, identical to what they'd found before. Here, she called, dismounting. Ethan swung down beside her. The wire had been cut, several cattle driven through, then the fence hastily repaired. Fresh tracks led away to the southeast, toward rougher country where stolen cattle could be hidden easily. How many this time? Ethan asked, examining the tracks. Hard to say. At least 10, maybe more. Clara knelt, studying the hoofprints. Shod horses, 2 riders, maybe 3. Recent, within the last day or 2. Ethan felt cold fury settle in his gut. This wasn't random theft. This was systematic, targeted, someone who knew his land and his routines well enough to pick moments when he wouldn't notice until it was too late. We need to track them, he said. We need to report them, Clara countered. This is a job for the territorial marshal, not 2 people on horseback in open country. By the time the marshal gets here, they'll be long gone. And if we track them alone, they might shoot us, Clara said bluntly. Ethan, I know you're angry. So am I. But charging after armed cattle thieves with no backup is how people get killed. He wanted to argue, wanted to insist they could handle it. But she was right again, and he was tired of fighting against right just to maintain the illusion of control. Fine, he said. We'll ride to town, report it, and see if the marshal can track them from here. Clara nodded. They repaired the fence again, marking it carefully so the marshal could find it, and headed back to the ranch house. But instead of riding straight to town, Ethan turned toward the line shack on the eastern edge of his property, a small shelter used during roundups where tools and supplies were stored. What are we doing? Clara asked. Checking something. The line shack was unlocked, as always. Inside, Ethan scanned the shelves where he kept extra tools, rope, and supplies. Several items were missing, a good knife, 2 coils of rope, a set of wire cutters. Someone's been here, he said quietly. Clara examined the space, her expression grim. Someone who knows where you keep things. Someone who's been here before. The implication was clear. This wasn't strangers passing through. This was someone with access, with knowledge, with opportunity. Tom Fletcher had worked the spring roundup. He knew the property, knew the routines, knew where supplies were kept. Ethan sank down onto the rough bench, the weight of betrayal settling heavy on his shoulders. "You were right," he said, "about checking before hiring him back." Clara sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "I take no pleasure in being right about this." "I hired him 3 times, Ethan said, staring at his hands. "Paid him fair wages, trusted him, and he was robbing me the whole time." "You couldn't have known, not without better records, better systems. You knew. You figured it out in a week." "Because I was looking at numbers, not people. Because I didn't have history with him." Clara's voice was gentle. "Ethan, being betrayed doesn't mean you were foolish to trust. It means someone abused your trust. That's on them, not you." The kindness in her words cracked something in Ethan's chest. He'd expected her to be smug, to press her advantage, to use this moment to prove she'd been right and he'd been wrong. Instead, she was offering comfort, understanding, partnership. "I'm sorry," he said, "for last night, for trying to make this about control instead of listening to your concerns." "I'm sorry too," Clara said. "I could have approached it differently, been less confrontational." "You were fine. I was the one being stubborn." Ethan turned to face her. "This partnership thing, I'm going to keep making mistakes. I'm going to keep wanting to do things my way because it's familiar and safe. But I'm going to try to do better." Clara's expression softened. "We're both going to make mistakes. The question is whether we can forgive them and learn from them, or whether we'll let them drive us apart." "I vote for the forgiving and learning option." "Agreed." They rode to town and reported the theft to Marshal Davies, a grizzled man in his 50s who'd been enforcing what law existed in the territory for 2 decades. He listened to their account, examined the fence repair, and promised to organize a tracking party. "Tom Fletcher, you say?" Davies scratched his jaw thoughtfully. "He's been on my radar before, nothing I could prove. But if he's working with a gang, that's different. I'll see what I can dig up." Back at the ranch that evening, Ethan and Clara worked side by side in a silence that felt companionable rather than tense. Clara prepared dinner while Ethan updated the fence inspection logs with the new information. Over the meal, they talked through options, hiring different hands they could trust, improving security around vulnerable pastures, maybe even bringing in a couple of dogs to alert them to nighttime activity. It felt strange, this collaboration. But it also felt right in a way Ethan couldn't quite articulate. For the first time in 6 years, problems didn't rest solely on his shoulders. Clara carried half the weight, offered half the solutions, and somehow that made everything more manageable rather than less. After dinner, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the western hills, Clara spoke quietly. "My father died when I was 14, she said. "Pneumonia, quick and brutal. My mother remarried within a year to a man who saw me as an inconvenience. I was sent to live with my aunt and uncle in Philadelphia, who made it clear I was there on sufferance, not affection. I learned early that depending on family didn't guarantee security or kindness." Ethan listened without interrupting, understanding that she was offering him something: context, history, the reasons behind her independence. "I worked as a teacher for 6 years, Clara continued, saved every penny I could, hoping to establish my own school someday. But the superintendent made it clear that advancement wasn't available to unmarried women, especially not old maids with radical ideas about educating girls the same as boys. Then my aunt died. My uncle made it clear I needed to leave, and I had a choice: find a husband quickly and settle for whoever would have me, or use my savings to go somewhere new and try again." "So you came here," Ethan said. "So I came here, to a territory where I'd heard women had more opportunities, more freedom. I didn't expect to find a husband. I expected to find work, independence, maybe eventually a small piece of land I could call my own." She smiled slightly. "I didn't expect to become a rancher within 2 weeks of arriving." "And now that you are, do you regret it?" Clara turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the last light of day. "Ask me again in a month, in a year. Ask me when we've survived our first winter together, our first real crisis, our first time when walking away would be easier than staying. Then I'll know if I regret it." "Fair enough," Ethan said. "I'll ask you then." The days rolled forward toward the wedding date with increasing momentum. Clara transformed the neglected kitchen garden into something productive, planting vegetables that could withstand the heat and drought.
Ethan built her a better chicken coop and brought in 6 hens from a rancher who was selling off stock, giving them a source of fresh eggs. Together, they reorganized the barn, creating better storage systems and improving the workflow for feeding and caring for the horses. Marshal Davies returned 5 days after their initial report with mixed news. He'd tracked the rustlers to a box canyon 20 miles south, recovered 9 of the stolen cattle, but the thieves themselves had scattered before he could apprehend them. Tom Fletcher had vanished from the territory entirely, which was as good as a confession. "We'll keep watch," Davies promised. "If he shows his face again, we'll grab him. In the meantime, I'd recommend you hire more reliable help." Finding that help proved challenging. The approaching wedding had become common knowledge in Copper Springs, and with it came assumptions about Clara that set Ethan's teeth on edge. He heard men in the saloon speculating about why an Eastern woman would marry a rancher she barely knew, heard the crude jokes about what Ethan must be getting out of the arrangement, heard the dismissive comments about women trying to manage things they didn't understand. He'd never cared much about town gossip before, but now it grated on him. Clara deserved better than to be treated like some desperate spinster who'd trapped a bachelor into marriage. The anger must have shown on his face because Clara, who'd accompanied him to town to purchase fabric for new curtains, took one look at him and steered him out of the general store before he could confront the men whose voices had carried through the open door. "Let it go," she said quietly as they loaded the wagon. "They're insulting you. They're gossiping, which is what people do in small towns. It doesn't matter what they think." "It matters to me." Clara stopped, a bolt of fabric in her hands, and studied his face with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Why?" The question caught him off guard. Why did it matter? They weren't really married yet, weren't even sure this arrangement would work long term. The gossip shouldn't bother him. But it did, because somewhere in the past 2 weeks, Clara had stopped being a solution to his legal problem and had become a person he respected, valued, maybe even cared about. And hearing her diminished, hearing their partnership reduced to crude jokes and baseless assumptions, felt like a personal attack. "Because you deserve respect," he said finally. "Because what we're building is worth more than their small-minded gossip." Clara's expression softened. "Thank you for that. But Ethan, you can't fight every person who misunderstands or misjudges us. We know the truth of what we're doing. That has to be enough." She was right, but it didn't make the anger disappear. They finished loading the wagon in silence, and on the ride home, Ethan found himself thinking about the Reverend's words, that practical arrangements sometimes surprised everyone by becoming something more. He wasn't sure what more meant in their context. They'd established partnership, mutual respect, even a growing friendship. But there were still 2 separate bedrooms, still careful boundaries neither of them had attempted to cross. They worked side by side during the day, but retreated to their own spaces at night. They shared everything except intimacy, and Ethan didn't know if that was sustainable long-term or if it would eventually tear apart what they were building. A week before the wedding, the summer storms arrived with a vengeance. Thunder rolled across the desert, lightning split the sky, and rain fell in sheets that turned the dusty earth to mud. The cattle huddled miserably in the low places, the horses stayed close to the barn, and Ethan spent 2 days riding in the downpour to make sure none of the stock were caught in flash floods. Clara stayed busy at the house, dealing with a roof leak in the kitchen that Ethan hadn't known existed, catching water in every available pot and pan. When he came in soaked and exhausted on the second evening, she had dry clothes waiting, hot coffee brewing, and a towel to dry his hair. "The leak is above the stove," she reported. "I've patched it temporarily, but you'll need to get up there and fix it properly when the weather clears." Ethan changed in his room, then came back to find Clara stirring a pot of stew that smelled like heaven. His clothes were already hanging near the fire to dry, and she'd laid out clean socks without being asked. These small acts of care, repeated daily, were wearing down his defenses faster than any grand gesture could have. He wasn't used to being looked after, wasn't used to someone anticipating his needs and meeting them without expecting gratitude or payment. "You don't have to do all this," he said, gesturing vaguely at the domestic efficiency surrounding them. "I know." Clara didn't look up from the stew. "But we're partners, and partners take care of each other. You spent 2 days in the rain making sure our cattle were safe. The least I can do is make sure you don't catch pneumonia in the process." "Our cattle," Ethan repeated softly. The words still felt strange, but less frightening than they had 2 weeks ago. That night, the storm intensified. Wind howled around the house, driving rain against the windows with force that made the glass rattle. Ethan lay in bed listening to the chaos outside, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. A soft knock on his door brought him upright. "Yeah?" Clara opened the door slightly. She was in a nightgown and robe, her hair in a long braid over one shoulder, and she looked uncertain in a way he'd never seen before. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, "but there's water coming through my ceiling now. The bedroom's flooding." Ethan was on his feet immediately, grabbing a lamp. In Clara's room, water was indeed dripping steadily from a crack in the ceiling, pooling on the floor and soaking into the rug beside her bed. "Must be the same leak, spread wider than I thought," he muttered, grabbing a bucket from the kitchen to catch the worst of it. "You can't sleep in here tonight." "I'll sleep on the sofa," Clara said. "You'll sleep in my room. I'll take the sofa." "Ethan, it's not a debate, Clara. My room is dry, the bed is bigger, and you'll actually get some rest. I've slept in worse places than a sofa." He started gathering her things, the books from her bedside table, her brush, the small bag containing her personal items. "Come on." Clara followed him to his room, protesting the whole way, but he was immovable. He gave her fresh blankets, made sure she had everything she needed, and headed for the door. "Ethan," her voice stopped him. "Thank you. For all of this. The room, the partnership, the respect." He turned back to face her, this woman who'd walked into his life barely 3 weeks ago and somehow become essential to it. "You don't need to thank me for treating you like an equal. That's just basic decency." "You'd be surprised how rare basic decency is," Clara said quietly. "Good night." "Good night." He closed the door and made his way to the sofa, which was indeed uncomfortable enough that sleep would be elusive. But as he lay there listening to the storm, he realized something had shifted again. Clara was sleeping in his bed, in his room, surrounded by his things. And instead of feeling threatened or trapped, he felt protective. Glad that she was dry and safe and comfortable. Glad that she was here. The storm blew itself out by morning, leaving the world washed clean and bright. Ethan was up early, despite the lack of sleep, inspecting the damage. The roof leaks were worse than he'd thought. The whole eastern section needed repair, work that would take days and require materials from town. Clara emerged from his room looking well-rested, her hair already pinned up, dressed for work. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough. I'll need to ride to town, get supplies, and spend the next week making repairs. I'll come with you. We can take measurements together. Make sure you get exactly what you need." They spent the morning on the roof, Clara holding one end of the measuring tape while Ethan calculated square footage and made notes. She wasn't afraid of heights, didn't complain about the heat or the precarious footing, just worked alongside him as she'd been doing since that first week. When they finally climbed down for lunch, Ethan found himself studying her, the way she moved with increasing confidence around the ranch, the way she'd stopped asking permission for anything and just did what needed doing, the way she met his eyes as an equal rather than with deference or challenge. "What?" she asked, catching him staring. "Nothing," he said. "Just thinking that in 4 days we'll be married and I still barely know you." Clara smiled. "What do you want to know?" "What's your favorite book?" The question clearly surprised her. "Jane Eyre, though my uncle thought it entirely too radical for a young woman." "Because the heroine is independent and opinionated?" "Exactly." "Can't imagine why that appealed to you," Ethan said dryly, earning a laugh. "What about you?" Clara asked. "What's something I don't know about you?" Ethan considered. "I can play the harmonica. Taught myself one winter when I was snowed in for 3 weeks straight. Haven't played in years, but I still remember how." "I'd like to hear it sometime." "Maybe." They fell into an easy exchange, trading small revelations and discoveries. Clara had wanted to be a doctor before being told it was impossible for a woman. Ethan had once broken his arm falling off a horse and said it himself because the nearest doctor was 3 days away. Clara spoke French fluently. Ethan could track almost anything across any terrain. Small pieces of each other, shared over coffee and leftover cornbread, building the foundation of understanding that they'd need when the legal partnership became a real marriage. On the last evening before their wedding, Ethan found Clara on the porch at sunset, watching the sky turn impossible shades of orange and gold. He sat beside her, and they shared a comfortable silence, broken only by the evening sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing in the distance, horses moving in the corral, the wind rustling through the sparse grass.
"Are you afraid?" Clara asked suddenly. "Of tomorrow?" "Of everything tomorrow represents." Ethan considered lying, then remembered that honesty was what they'd promised each other. "Yeah. I'm afraid I won't be good enough at this, that I'll fail you somehow, that you'll wake up 6 months from now and realize you made a mistake tying yourself to a man who doesn't know how to be anything except alone." Clara reached over and took his hand, her fingers warm and sure around his. "I'm afraid too. Afraid I'll push too hard or demand too much. Afraid that the independence that brought me here will be the thing that drives you away. Afraid that we're building something beautiful on a foundation of legal necessity, and someday that won't be enough to hold it together." "So we're both terrified," Ethan said, "completely." "Good." He squeezed her hand. "At least we're terrified together." Clara laughed, and the sound eased something in his chest. Tomorrow they'd stand before Reverend Calloway and make promises that would bind them legally, socially, permanently. But tonight, sitting on this porch under the Arizona sky, Ethan realized they'd already made the promises that mattered. To try, to be honest, to meet each other as equals even when it was hard. The rest was just paperwork. "Clara?" "Yes?" "I'm glad you didn't get back on that stage to Philadelphia." She turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the sunset. "So am I." They sat together until full dark, hands still clasped, neither wanting to be the first to let go. And when they finally went inside to their separate rooms for the last time before becoming husband and wife, Ethan lay awake feeling something he hadn't felt in 10 years. Hope. Fragile and new, but undeniably real. Hope that maybe he'd been wrong about needing to face the world alone. Hope that partnership might be strength instead of weakness. Hope that the woman sleeping down the hall might become not just his legal wife, but his true partner in every sense that mattered. Tomorrow would tell. But tonight, hope was enough. The wedding itself took 15 minutes. Reverend Calloway performed the ceremony in his small office rather than the church, with Mrs. Henderson and the store owner Jacobson serving as witnesses. Clara wore a simple dress in dove gray that she'd sewn herself from the fabric they'd bought weeks ago, and Ethan had put on his only suit, brushed clean and smelling faintly of cedar from the trunk where it had been stored since he'd arrived in the territory. The words were standard, the promises traditional, but when Ethan took Clara's hand and spoke his vows, he meant them in a way he hadn't expected to. This wasn't just legal convenience anymore. This was choosing her, choosing partnership, choosing to believe that what they'd built in 3 weeks could sustain a lifetime. When Reverend Calloway pronounced them husband and wife, there was an awkward moment where everyone seemed to wait for a kiss. Ethan met Clara's eyes, saw the same uncertainty reflected there, and settled for squeezing her hand instead. She squeezed back, and somehow that felt more intimate than any kiss would have been. Mrs. Henderson had prepared a small celebration at the boarding house, cake, coffee, and well wishes from the handful of townspeople who'd gathered. They stayed an hour, accepting congratulations from people who still didn't quite understand what they were witnessing, then rode back to the ranch as the afternoon sun blazed overhead. "Well," Clara said as they approached the property line, "we did it." "We did," Ethan agreed. He glanced at her, this woman who was now legally his wife, and found himself searching for something to say that would mark the significance of the moment. "Should feel different, I guess." "Does it?" He considered. "No, and yes. We're the same people we were this morning, but the promises are real now. Legal, permanent." Permanent, unless we choose otherwise," Clara corrected gently. "The marriage gives us security, but the partnership is what we make of it every day." They reached the ranch house to find everything exactly as they'd left it, the repaired roof holding strong, the garden thriving despite the heat, the cattle visible in the southern pasture. Nothing had changed, except everything had. That evening, they sat at dinner across from each other as they had dozens of times before, but the air felt charged with unspoken questions. They were married now. They shared a name, a property, a legal bond, but they still maintained separate bedrooms, separate spaces, boundaries neither had attempted to cross. "I've been thinking," Clara said, setting down her fork, "about the sleeping arrangements." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Yeah?"
The leak in my room is fixed. The ceiling is sound. I should move back to my own space. She paused, her gaze steady on his. Unless you'd prefer otherwise. The question hung between them, weighted with implications. Ethan knew what a normal marriage would look like, what people expected, what the law assumed when it required a family household. But nothing about their arrangement had been normal from the start. What would you prefer? He asked, deflecting. I asked you first. Clara. He set down his own fork, giving her his full attention. I'm not going to pressure you into anything. We agreed on partnership and respect, and that includes respecting whatever boundaries you need. That's not an answer. Fine. Honest answer? He took a breath. I don't know what I want. Part of me thinks we should maintain what's working. Separate spaces, clear boundaries, partnership without complication. But another part of me remembers the night of the storm, knowing you were safe and comfortable in my room, and thinking that felt right in a way I can't explain. Clara's expression softened. I felt the same way. Safe. Like maybe separate bedrooms were less about propriety and more about fear. Fear of what? Of getting too close. Of this becoming more than a practical arrangement and not knowing how to handle it if it does. She folded her hands on the table. Ethan, I'm not suggesting we consummate this marriage tonight. I'm not even sure I'm ready for that. But I am suggesting that maybe we stop treating each other like business associates who happen to share a house. What does that look like? I don't know, Clara admitted. Maybe we figure it out together. Maybe we stop pretending that 3 weeks of working side by side hasn't created something that feels like more than partnership. Maybe we acknowledge that we're both afraid of caring too much and decide to be brave anyway. Ethan studied her face in the lamplight, the intelligence in her eyes, the strength in the set of her jaw, the vulnerability she was showing him despite her obvious fear. This woman had walked into his fortress and somehow convinced him to open the gates. She'd challenged him, respected him, stood beside him as an equal, and somewhere along the way, she'd become essential. I care about you, he said quietly, more than I wanted to, more than is probably wise given how little time we've known each other. And that scares the hell out of me because everyone I've ever cared about has left, one way or another. I'm not going anywhere, Clara said. I signed papers, made vows, planted a garden. This is my home now too, and I don't abandon what's mine. You say that now. I say that always. She reached across the table, offering her hand. Ethan, I can't promise we won't hurt each other. People do, even when they're trying not to. But I can promise I won't run at the first difficulty. I can promise I'll fight for what we're building here. Can you promise the same? He took her hand, her skin warm and real against his. Yes, I can promise that. I can. Then let's stop sleeping in separate rooms like strangers. Let's share a bed, even if all we do is sleep. Let's stop pretending this is just business when it stopped being business the moment you asked me to teach you the accounting system. Ethan felt something in his chest crack open, some old wound beginning to heal. Okay, he said. Okay. That night, they prepared for bed with nervous formality, like teenagers at their first dance. Clara changed in her old room while Ethan changed in his, and when she knocked on his door wearing a simple nightgown with a robe over it, he felt his heart hammering against his ribs. I can still take the other room, she said softly. I don't want you to. He pulled back the covers on the far side of the bed. But I meant what I said. No pressure, no expectations. Clara slipped off the robe and climbed into bed, staying carefully on her side. Ethan extinguished the lamp and lay down on his own side, acutely aware of the warmth of her body 2 feet away from his, the sound of her breathing in the darkness. Ethan? Yeah? Thank you for making me feel safe enough to try this. Thank you for being brave enough to suggest it. They lay in silence for a while, the darkness soft around them. Eventually, Clara's breathing deepened into sleep, and Ethan found himself relaxing by degrees. This wasn't terrifying. This was peaceful. Right. Like something that had been missing had finally clicked into place. He fell asleep to the sound of her breathing and slept more soundly than he had in years. The next week settled into a new rhythm. They rose together, worked together, ate together, and went to bed together. Sometimes they talked late into the night about everything and nothing. Clara's childhood in Pennsylvania, Ethan's years drifting through Texas, their hopes for the ranch. their fears about the future. Sometimes they simply lay in comfortable silence, their presence enough. Gradually, the careful distance between them on the bed lessened. One cool night, Ethan woke to find Clara had rolled against him in her sleep, seeking warmth. He put his arm around her without thinking, and she settled deeper into sleep against his chest. The next morning, they woke tangled together and didn't speak of it, but that night Clara didn't stay on her side of the bed, and Ethan didn't pretend he minded. The work of the ranch continued. They hired 2 new hands based on recommendations from Marshall Davies, young men named Miguel and John, who were honest, hardworking, and grateful for fair wages. Together, the 4 of them completed the fence repairs, improved the water systems, and prepared for the fall roundup. Clara's organizational systems transformed the ranch's efficiency. She created schedules for pasture rotation, inventory tracking for every tool and supply, financial projections that showed they could actually expand their operation if they managed carefully. Ethan found himself consulting her on every major decision, not because he had to, but because her perspective made everything better. "You should hire another hand for winter," Clara said one evening over the account books. "The workload is too much for 4 people when the snow comes, and we can afford it now that we're not losing money to theft." "Winter hands are hard to find," Ethan said. "Most drift south when the weather turns." "Then we offer better terms. A bunkhouse we actually heat, regular meals, fair wages paid on time. You'd be surprised what people will endure for security and respect." She was right, as usual. By the time the first snow fell in November, they had 5 hands: Miguel, John, and 3 others who'd heard that Iron Creek Ranch treated its workers well. The bunkhouse that had stood mostly empty for years now held life and purpose. But success brought attention. Other ranchers noticed Iron Creek's improvements, and some didn't appreciate what they saw as a woman interfering in men's business. Ethan heard the comments in town, that Clara was too controlling, too opinionated, that she'd probably henpecked him into submission. He ignored most of it, but when he heard Ben Morrison, a rancher from the next valley over, making crude jokes about Clara in the saloon, something in Ethan snapped. "Say that again," he said, his voice dangerous quiet. Morrison, drunk and belligerent, turned to face him. "I said your wife's got you by the balls, Hale. Everyone knows it. Woman comes out here from back east and takes over a man's ranch in 3 weeks? That's not partnership. That's conquest." Ethan's fist connected with Morrison's jaw before he'd consciously decided to throw the punch. Morrison went down hard and Ethan stood over him, rage coursing through his veins. "My wife is a better rancher than you'll ever be," Ethan said. "She's smarter, harder working, and more successful than half the men in this territory. You don't like that? That's your problem, not hers." Marshall Davies appeared, pulling Ethan back before the fight could escalate. "That's enough, both of you. Morrison, sleep it off. Ethan, go home before you do something that'll land you in a cell." Ethan rode back to the ranch with his knuckles bleeding and his temper still hot. Clara was waiting on the porch, and one look at his face told her everything. "What happened?" "Ben Morrison had opinions about our marriage. I adjusted his face." "Ethan," her voice held both exasperation and something that might have been affection, "you can't punch everyone who talks about us." "I can try," he muttered. Clara took his hand, examining his split knuckles. "Come inside. Let me clean this before it gets infected." In the kitchen, she worked with gentle efficiency, cleaning the cuts and bandaging his hand. Ethan watched her face, the concentration in her expression, the care in her touch. "I can handle gossip," she said quietly. "I've been handling it my whole life. Talk about being too old, too unmarried, too educated, too independent. None of it matters." "It matters to me," Ethan said. "It matters that people respect you the way you deserve." Clara looked up, meeting his eyes. "Why?" "Because you're my wife." The words came out more intense than he'd intended. "Because what we've built here is real and important, and I won't let anyone diminish it." "Ethan." Her hands were still on his, warm and steady. "Are we still pretending this is just a practical arrangement?" The question hung in the air between them. Ethan thought about the past 2 months, waking up beside her every morning, working alongside her every day, falling asleep with her in his arms every night. Thought about how the house felt empty when she rode to town without him, how her laugh had become his favorite sound, how her opinion had become the one that mattered most. No, he said.
We're not pretending anymore. Clara's expression shifted into something tender and fierce all at once. Good, because I stopped pretending weeks ago. She leaned forward, and Ethan met her halfway, their lips meeting in a kiss that was long overdue. It started gentle, tentative, then deepened into something that felt like coming home. When they finally pulled apart, Ethan rested his forehead against hers, breathing hard. I love you, he said, the words both terrifying and inevitable. I don't know when it happened or how, but I do. I love you too, Clara whispered.
I think I have since you asked me to teach you the accounting system and actually listened. They kissed again, and this time it led to the bedroom, to the slow discovery of each other, to the consummation of a marriage that had started as legal necessity and become something far more precious. Afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, Ethan felt the last of his defenses crumble. I was so afraid of this, he admitted, of needing someone, of caring too much, of being weak. This isn't weakness, Claire said, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. This is the bravest thing either of us has ever done. Choosing to trust, choosing to love, choosing each other despite all the reasons we had to stay safe and separate. No going back now, Ethan said. Would you want to? He pulled her closer, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his. Not for anything in the world. November gave way to December, and with it came the first serious test of their partnership. Word reached them through Marshal Davies that Tom Fletcher and his gang had been spotted in the territory again, moving cattle through the rough country south of Iron Creek. Other ranches had reported losses, and the gang was getting bolder. We need to increase patrols, Clara said, studying the map Ethan had drawn of their property. Double the fence checks, vary the timing, maybe set up a watch rotation at night. That means someone awake and alert all night. Every night, Ethan said. That's exhausting, and we can't keep it up long term. We won't have to. Winter's coming, which makes cattle theft harder. If we can protect our stock through the next month, Fletcher will likely move on to easier targets. They implemented the new security measures. Ethan, Miguel, and John took turns on night watch, riding the fence lines in the darkness, alert for any signs of intrusion. It was grueling work on top of the regular ranch operations, but after 2 weeks with no incidents, they started to relax. That was when Fletcher struck. It happened on a moonless night in mid-December. Ethan was on watch, patrolling the eastern boundary, when he heard the distant sound of cattle moving wrong, not the lazy drift of grazing animals, but the directed push of a drive. He spurred his horse toward the sound, his rifle already in his hands. Through the darkness, he could make out shapes, at least a dozen cattle being herded toward a gap in the fence line, 3 riders managing them with practiced efficiency. Ethan recognized Tom Fletcher's profile even in the darkness. That's far enough, Ethan called out, raising his rifle. Step away from the cattle. The response was a gunshot that whined past his head, close enough to feel the displacement of air. Ethan dove from his saddle, using his horse for cover, and returned fire. The cattle scattered in panic, and the riders wheeled their horses, shooting as they retreated. Back at the ranch house, Clara heard the gunshots and felt her blood turn to ice. She grabbed the revolver she'd cleaned weeks ago, loaded it with hands that didn't shake despite her fear, and ran for the barn. Miguel! John! The hands appeared, already armed, already moving. They're shooting at the east fence line. Ethan's out there alone. They saddled horses in record time. Clara mounted Daisy, her mare, and led them toward the sound of gunfire at a pace that was reckless in the darkness, but necessary given the stakes. If something happened to Ethan, if she lost him now after finally finding the courage to love him. The thought was unbearable, so she pushed it away and focused on riding, on reaching him, on being the partner he needed. They found him pinned down behind a rock outcropping, exchanging shots with 2 riders while a third tried to flank him through the scrub. Clara didn't hesitate. She raised her revolver, aimed at the ground in front of the flanking rider's horse, and fired. The horse reared, dumping its rider. The other 2, suddenly outnumbered, spurred their horses and fled into the night. The dismounted rider tried to run, but Miguel cut him off, rifle aimed at his chest. Don't move, Miguel commanded. Clara rode straight to Ethan, who was climbing to his feet, dust-covered and bleeding from a graze on his shoulder but alive. She practically fell off her horse and into his arms, checking him for injuries with hands that shook now that the danger had passed. I'm fine, he said, holding her tight. Clara, I'm fine. You're bleeding. It's nothing, just a graze. He pulled back enough to see her face. What are you doing out here? You should have stayed at the house where it's safe. Clara's fear transformed instantly into fury. Safe? While you're being shot at? Ethan Hale, we're partners. That means I don't sit home safe while you risk your life alone. I know you can handle it, Clara interrupted, her voice fierce. But you don't have to anymore. When are you going to understand that? You're not alone. You're never alone again unless you choose to be. Ethan stared at her. This woman who'd ridden into danger, armed and determined to stand beside him, and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of what strength meant. You're right, he said quietly. I'm sorry. The captured rider turned out to be one of Fletcher's gang, a young man barely 20 who broke under questioning and revealed the whole operation. Fletcher had been systematically targeting ranches across 3 territories, using local knowledge from hands he'd worked with to identify vulnerable properties and optimal times to strike. He'd planned to hit Iron Creek one last time before winter, taking enough cattle to set himself up somewhere far from the marshal's reach. Instead, he'd lost a man, scattered his operation, and failed to steal a single head of cattle. Marshal Davies arrived at dawn to take the prisoner into custody. You did good work here, he told Ethan and Clara. Fletcher will hear his man talked, and he'll know this territory is too hot for him now. I expect he'll move on for good. Good riddance, Clara said, her arm around Ethan's waist. After the marshal left, they stood together looking out over the land as the sun rose, painting everything in shades of gold and pink. The cattle were recovered, the fence would be repaired, and the crisis had been survived. I thought I was going to lose you, Clara said quietly. When I heard those gunshots, when I realized you were out there alone facing 3 armed men, I thought, I know. Ethan pulled her closer. I thought the same thing when I saw you riding toward the shooting. Clara, you could have been killed. So could you. She turned to face him. Ethan, I meant what I said. We're partners in everything now. The business, the danger, the decisions, all of it. I can't be the kind of wife who stays safe while you risk everything. That's not who I am, and it's not the partnership we built. I'm starting to understand that, Ethan said. I spent so long believing that caring about someone meant weakness, that depending on anyone was dangerous. But last night, knowing you were there, knowing I had backup, knowing I wasn't facing it alone, that didn't make me weak. It made me stronger. It made us stronger, Clara corrected. Yeah, Ethan agreed. It did. They walked back to the house hand in hand as the ranch woke up around them. The hands were already moving, starting the day's work, checking on the scattered cattle, beginning repairs on the damaged fence. Life continued, the crisis already becoming just another challenge they'd faced and overcome together. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ethan realized something that would have terrified him 6 months ago, but now filled him with quiet certainty. He'd spent 6 years building Iron Creek Ranch into something worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth risking everything to keep. But the ranch wasn't what he'd nearly died defending last night. It wasn't what had made Clara ride into danger armed and determined. What they were protecting now wasn't land or cattle or legal ownership. It was each other. It was the partnership they'd forged from necessity and transformed into love. It was the home they'd built not just in timber and stone, but in trust and respect and the willingness to be brave enough to need each other. The judge had told him to marry or lose the ranch. He'd married to save the land. But somewhere along the way, the land had stopped being what mattered most. Clara had become the thing worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth cherishing above all else. What are you thinking? Clara asked, noticing his expression. That the judge was right, Ethan said. About what? About what makes a home. He said I needed to establish a family household. I thought that meant going through legal motions, signing papers, putting a wife's name on a deed. He took her hand, lacing their fingers together. But it actually meant this. It meant finding someone to build a life with, someone to share the burdens and the triumphs, someone who makes the whole thing worthwhile. Clara's eyes shone in the dying light. Are you saying you're glad the law forced you to marry me? I'm saying I'm grateful for whatever chain of events brought you to my porch that day, Ethan said. The law, your need for a fresh start, my desperate stubbornness, all of it. Because it brought me you, and you're the best thing that's ever happened to me. Even though I'm opinionated and controlling and right into gunfights when I should stay home safe, especially because of those things." He pulled her close, kissing her temple. "You own my heart, Clara Hale. Completely and permanently. I fought like hell to avoid admitting it, but there it is." "Good," Clara said, smiling against his chest. "Because you own mine too, and I don't plan on asking for it back." They sat together as darkness fell, two people who'd started as strangers, become partners, and transformed into something that looked a lot like forever. The ranch stretched out around them, secure and thriving, a testament to what could be built when two people chose to trust each other despite their fears. But Ethan knew now that the real accomplishment wasn't the successful ranch, or the defeated rustlers, or even the marriage that had defied everyone's expectations. The real accomplishment was that Clara Whitfield had walked into his fortress, and instead of conquering it or destroying it, she'd convinced him to open the gates and let her in. She'd shown him that love wasn't the weakness he'd always feared, but the greatest strength he'd ever known. And in doing so, she'd saved not just his land, but his life, his heart, and his soul. Winter settled over Iron Creek Ranch with a beauty that was as dangerous as it was breathtaking. Snow covered the high desert in a blanket of white that transformed the landscape into something almost otherworldly, and temperatures dropped so low that water froze in the buckets overnight. The cattle huddled together for warmth in the protected valleys, and the horses grew thick winter coats that made them look twice their normal size. Clara thrived in the cold months. She'd grown up with Pennsylvania winters and knew how to prepare, how to conserve, how to make a home warm and welcoming when the world outside was brutal. She canned vegetables from the fall harvest, stocked the pantry with enough supplies to last months, and kept the fire burning steady in the main room so that the house remained a haven against the elements. Ethan watched her work with a mixture of admiration and something deeper, a contentment he'd never experienced before. She moved through their home with confident grace, making decisions without second-guessing herself, creating systems that kept them comfortable and secure. More than that, she made the long winter evenings something to look forward to rather than endure. They would sit together after dinner, Clara reading aloud from one of her books, while Ethan worked on tack repairs or whittled small projects from scrap wood. Sometimes they'd talk for hours about everything and nothing, plans for spring expansion, memories from their separate pasts, dreams for a future that now included children they both wanted but hadn't yet discussed seriously. Sometimes they'd simply exist in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes when two people are so at ease with each other that words become optional. But beneath the domestic contentment, something else was happening to Ethan, something he didn't recognize until it was too late. The happiness he'd found with Clara, the vulnerability he'd allowed himself, the depth of his love for her, all of it terrified some deep, wounded part of him that had spent years building walls for protection. Every morning he woke up beside her. Every evening he came home to her smile. Every night he fell asleep holding her. That fear grew a little stronger. What if she left? What if she realized she'd made a mistake? What if he failed her somehow and lost everything that mattered? The thoughts were irrational, he knew that. Clara had proven her commitment 100 times over. She'd stood beside him against rustlers, transformed his failing operation into a thriving one, chosen him every single day for months. But fear doesn't listen to logic, and the wounds from his childhood, from his father's failures and his mother's death, and all the ways he'd learned that depending on people led to pain, those wounds ran deeper than reason could reach. He started pulling back in small ways, spending more time alone on the range than necessary, making decisions without consulting Clara, then feeling guilty about it. Holding something back when they talked, some part of himself he kept protected just in case. Creating distance as insurance against the loss he couldn't stop fearing. Clara noticed, of course. She'd notice if he breathed differently. "You've been quiet lately," she said one evening in late January. They were sitting at the table after dinner, the account books open between them, but Ethan's attention kept drifting to the window where snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes. "Just tired," he said, which was true, but not the whole truth. "Ethan." Clara closed the ledger, giving him her full attention. "Talk to me. What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Don't do that. Don't shut me out and pretend everything's fine when it clearly isn't." Her voice was gentle but firm. We promised to be honest with each other, remember? He did remember. He remembered every promise they'd made, which was part of the problem. Promises could be broken, people could leave, love could end. I don't want to burden you with it, he said finally. With what? Ethan stood, walking to the window, needing the physical distance. With the fact that I'm terrified. Every single day, Clara. Terrified that I'll wake up and this will be gone. That you'll realize you deserve better than a rancher who barely knows how to talk about feelings. That I'll fail you somehow and lose you. The confession hung in the air between them. Clara was quiet for a long moment, and Ethan couldn't bring himself to turn around and see her expression. So you're pulling away, she said softly, creating distance to protect yourself from a loss that hasn't happened and might never happen. Maybe. Ethan, look at me. He turned. Clara had stood as well, and her eyes held understanding rather than the hurt or anger he'd expected. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I've told you that before, but I'll tell you as many times as you need to hear it. I chose you. I choose you every day. Not because you're perfect or because this is easy, but because you're worth choosing, because what we have is worth fighting for. People say that until they don't, Ethan said, the old bitterness creeping into his voice. My father said he'd never give up on his dreams, and then he lost everything and drank himself to death. My mother promised she'd always be there, and then she died and left me alone. Everyone leaves eventually, Clara. Everyone. Then let me be the first one who doesn't. Clara crossed the room, taking his hands in hers. Ethan, I know you're scared. I'm scared too, but pulling away from me, shutting me out, creating distance, that doesn't protect you from loss. It just guarantees you'll be alone even while I'm standing right here. The truth of her words hit him hard. He'd been so focused on protecting himself from potential future pain that he was creating actual present pain. He was choosing loneliness over love because loneliness felt safer, more familiar, more controllable. I don't know how to stop being afraid, he admitted. I'm not asking you to stop being afraid. I'm asking you to be afraid and choose me anyway. Choose us. Choose to believe that what we have is strong enough to survive your fear. Clara's grip on his hands tightened. But Ethan, I can't do this alone. I can't be the only one fighting for this marriage while you keep one foot out the door just in case. That's not partnership. That's not love. She was right. Of course she was right. But knowing that didn't make it easier. I'll try, he said. I'll try to do better. That's all I'm asking. They held each other in the lamplight, and Ethan tried to believe that trying would be enough. But the fear didn't disappear just because he acknowledged it, and the walls he'd spent a lifetime building didn't crumble just because he wanted them to. Over the next weeks, Ethan made genuine efforts to stay present, to include Clara in decisions, to resist the urge to create protective distance. Some days were better than others, but the fear remained, a constant whisper in the back of his mind telling him that happiness this profound couldn't last, that he should prepare for the inevitable loss. Then February brought a storm that would test everything they'd built. It started with a sudden temperature drop that had the hands worried. Miguel, who'd grown up in the territory and knew its moods, watched the sky with increasing concern. Bad one coming, he told Ethan one afternoon. The kind that kills cattle and buries buildings. We need to prepare. They spent 2 days moving cattle to the most protected valleys, reinforcing the barn and outbuildings, stocking extra feed where the animals could reach it even in deep snow. Clara organized supplies inside the house, making sure they had enough food, fuel, and medical supplies to last weeks if necessary. This seems excessive, Ethan said, watching her inventory their stores for the third time. Better excessive than unprepared, Clara replied. Miguel's genuinely worried, and he's not the type to panic over normal weather. She was right to take it seriously. The storm hit on a Tuesday evening with a violence that shocked even Miguel. Wind screamed around the house, driving snow so thick that visibility dropped to zero within minutes. The temperature plummeted to levels that made exposed skin dangerous within seconds. They gathered in the main room, Ethan, Clara, and the 5 hands who'd made it to the house before the worst hit. Miguel and John had been out checking the cattle in the south pasture when the storm struck, and they came in half frozen, reporting that the herd was as secure as possible given the conditions. We did everything we could, Miguel said. his teeth chattering despite the warm fire. Now we waited out. The storm raged for 3 days. Snow piled against the house in drifts that reached the windows. The wind never stopped, a constant howl that made conversation difficult and sleep nearly impossible. They took turns keeping the fire going, rationing their wood supply carefully, playing cards and telling stories to pass the endless hours. On the 4th day, the wind finally died. The silence was almost startling after days of constant noise. Ethan opened the door to find the world transformed, snow everywhere, drifts 10 and 12 feet high in places. The landscape completely altered. "We need to check on the cattle," he said, "see what we lost." "We need to wait for conditions to stabilize," Clara countered. "The temperature is still deadly, and there could be more storms behind this one." "The cattle can't wait, Clara. If they're buried or stranded, every hour we delay means more deaths. Then send the hands out in pairs with strict instructions to stay together and return by dark. You don't need to go personally." "It's my ranch, my responsibility." "It's our ranch," Clara said, her voice sharp with frustration. "And I'm telling you that riding out alone in these conditions is suicide." But Ethan was already pulling on his heaviest coat, his mind made up. The cattle needed checking, the damage needed assessing, and sitting inside safe and warm while his livelihood potentially died in the snow was intolerable. "I'll take Miguel," he said, which was a compromise but not the one Clara wanted. "Ethan, please." Clara caught his arm. "Please don't do this. Wait one more day for the temperature to rise. Wait for better conditions. Don't risk yourself unnecessarily." "It's not unnecessary. It's the job." "The job can wait." "No, it can't." Ethan pulled free of her grip, already heading for the door. "I'll be back before dark. Don't worry." He left before she could argue further, and he refused to look back at her face because he knew what he'd see there: fear, frustration, and the dawning realization that he was doing exactly what she'd accused him of weeks ago. He was pulling away, making unilateral decisions, choosing the familiar pattern of self-reliance over the harder work of partnership. But acknowledging that didn't stop him. The fear that had been building for months had found a new expression. If he could just focus on the ranch work, on the cattle, on the tangible problems he knew how to solve, he could avoid the terrifying vulnerability of depending on Clara, of needing her, of admitting how completely she owned his heart. So he rode out into the deadly cold with Miguel, checking on cattle that had mostly survived better than expected, assessing damage that was significant but manageable. They found some losses: older animals that hadn't survived the temperature extremes, a few that had gotten separated and frozen, but overall, the herd was intact. "We should head back," Miguel said as the sun began its descent. "Temperature's dropping again." "One more pasture," Ethan said. "The north section. Then we'll go." "Ethan, it's getting dark and colder. We need to go now." "Go ahead. I'll check north and meet you back at the house." Miguel's expression showed exactly what he thought of that plan. "I'm not leaving you out here alone. We go together or we stay together." "I don't need a babysitter." "No, you need a partner, but you keep acting like you don't have one." Miguel's frustration broke through his usual deference. "Your wife is back at the house worried sick, and you're out here risking your life for cattle that will still be there tomorrow. What are you trying to prove, Ethan?" The question hit too close to the truth. Ethan wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. What was he trying to prove? That he didn't need anyone? That he could handle everything alone? That depending on Clara was somehow weakness rather than strength? "Fine," he said finally. "We'll head back." But they'd stayed out too long, and the temperature had dropped faster than anticipated. By the time they were halfway back to the ranch house, both men were dangerously cold. Ethan could feel it in his fingers and toes, the numbness creeping in, the lethargy that signaled hypothermia. "Keep moving," Miguel urged, his own voice slurred with cold. "Don't stop. Don't slow down. Just keep moving." Ethan tried. He genuinely tried. But his body was shutting down, conserving heat, preparing to surrender. He fell from his horse once, then twice. The second time he couldn't get back up. "Miguel," he said, or tried to say. His mouth wasn't working right. "Go, get help." Miguel was off his own horse, trying to pull Ethan upright. "Not leaving you. We go together, remember?" But Ethan was too heavy, too cold, too far gone. The world was fading to white around the edges, peaceful and quiet. It would be so easy to just rest here, to let the cold take him, to stop fighting. Then he thought of Clara, thought of her waiting at the house, watching for his return, choosing him every day just like she'd promised. Thought of all the ways he'd failed to choose her back, all the walls he'd maintained, all the fear he'd let dictate his actions. He thought of losing her not because she left, but because he'd been too stubborn, too afraid, too determined to prove he didn't need anyone, that he'd frozen to death in a snowdrift, trying to check on cattle that could have waited. The irony was crushing.
"Clara," he managed to say. "Tell Clara." But he couldn't finish the sentence because the cold finally won, and the world went dark. Back at the ranch house, Clara stood at the window watching for riders that didn't appear. The sun had set an hour ago. The temperature had dropped to lethal levels, and Ethan and Miguel were still out there somewhere in the darkness. "We have to go look for them," she said to John and the other hands. "In this cold, in the dark?" "Mrs. Hale, we'd just get lost ourselves," John said gently. "They're experienced men. They'll find shelter and wait it out. Or they're already dead." Clara's voice was flat, emotionless, because if she let herself feel the fear clawing at her chest, she'd collapse. "Saddle horses, bring lanterns, we're going." They tried to argue, but Clara's will was absolute. She was going to find her husband, and anyone who wanted to keep their job would help her do it.
They rode out into the freezing darkness, lanterns held high, calling out names that the wind snatched away. It was John who spotted Miguel's horse first, riderless and wandering. 100 yards beyond, they found the two men, Miguel semi-conscious but alive, Ethan completely unconscious and so cold he felt like ice. Clara didn't let herself panic. She directed the men with crisp efficiency. John in another hand would get Miguel back to the house immediately. She would stay with Ethan, working to warm him while they prepared a travois to transport him safely. "Mrs. Hale, you should go back with Miguel," John protested. "We can handle—" "I'm not leaving my husband." Clara's tone left no room for argument. "Get Miguel home and come back with blankets and the travois. Move." They moved. Clara dismounted and pulled Ethan against her, wrapping her coat around both of them, using her own body heat to warm him. She rubbed his hands and arms, trying to get his circulation going, talking to him constantly, even though he couldn't hear. "You don't get to die out here, Ethan Hale. Do you hear me? You don't get to run from your fear right into a snowdrift and leave me alone. We made promises. We built something, and I need you to fight for it. Fight for us. Fight to come back to me." His skin was so cold it hurt to touch, and she couldn't tell if he was breathing. Terror clawed at her throat, but she forced it down, forced herself to keep working, keep trying, keep believing he could survive this. The men returned with blankets and a makeshift travois. They wrapped Ethan carefully and began the slow journey back to the ranch house. Clara rode beside the travois, never taking her eyes off him, watching for any sign of life, any indication that she hadn't lost him. At the house, they carried him to the bedroom and stripped off his frozen clothes. Clara filled the bed with heated stones wrapped in cloth, covered him with every blanket they owned, and began the long process of trying to bring his body temperature back to survivable levels. Miguel, recovered enough to be coherent, came to check on them. "How is he?" "Alive," Clara said, which was all she knew for certain. "His heart's still beating. Beyond that, I don't know." "This is my fault," Miguel said quietly. "I should have insisted we turn back sooner." "This is Ethan's fault," Clara corrected, her voice hard with anger and fear. "He made the choice to stay out too long, to take unnecessary risks, to prioritize cattle over his own safety. You tried to stop him." Miguel nodded and left them alone. Clara sat beside the bed, holding Ethan's hand, waiting. The hours crawled by. His skin gradually warmed from icy to merely cold. His breathing, barely perceptible at first, became more steady. But he didn't wake up. Dawn came. Clara hadn't slept, hadn't moved except to change the heated stones and check his pulse. She was exhausted, terrified, and furious in equal measure. "You promised me you'd fight for us," she said to his unconscious form. "You promised you'd try. But the first test, the first moment when choosing me meant being vulnerable, trusting me, letting me protect you, you ran. You chose the cattle over your own life. You chose familiar patterns over the partnership we built. And now you're here, maybe dying, And I don't even get to tell you how angry I am that you did this." Her voice broke on the last words, and the tears she'd been holding back finally came. She laid her head on the bed beside him and let herself cry, for the fear, for the anger, for the love that made all of it hurt so much. She didn't notice when his hand moved just slightly to touch her hair. "Clara." The word was barely a whisper, hoarse and weak, but it brought her head up instantly. Ethan's eyes were open, unfocused but aware. "You're awake," she breathed. "Oh, thank everything. You're awake." "Miguel?" he managed. "He's fine. Recovered hours ago." Clara's hand tightened on his. "You nearly died, Ethan. You were so cold for so long. I thought I'd lost you." "I'm sorry." The words cost him obvious effort. "So sorry. You were right. About everything." "We'll talk about that when you're stronger," Clara said, though her voice was fierce. "Right now you need to rest, recover, get your strength back." But Ethan's grip on her hand tightened, as if he was afraid she'd leave. "No, need to say this now, in case I don't get another chance." "You'll get another chance. You're going to be fine." "Please." His eyes were clearer now, focused on her face with desperate intensity. "I was so afraid of losing you that I pushed you away, kept walls up, made decisions alone, all the things I promised not to do." "I know," Clara said softly. "And tonight, when I thought I was dying out there, all I could think about was how stupid I'd been, how I'd wasted time being afraid instead of loving you the way you deserved, how I'd let fear steal weeks we could have spent truly together." His voice was getting stronger, fueled by urgency. "I nearly died, Clara, and my last thought was that I'd failed you, failed to be the partner you needed, failed to choose you over my fear." "But you survived," Clara said, tears streaming down her face. "You're here, you're alive, and we get another chance." "I don't deserve another chance." "That's not your decision to make." Clara's voice was firm despite her tears. "I'm choosing to give you another chance, choosing to forgive you, choosing to believe that almost dying might finally convince you that love is worth the risk. But Ethan, this is the last time. I can't spend our marriage wondering when you'll pull away again, when fear will make you choose distance over partnership. If we survive this, you have to commit all the way. No more walls, no more running, no more protecting yourself from loss by guaranteeing loneliness." "I know." Ethan's eyes were bright with his own unshed tears. "I know, and I will. I promise. I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I choose you, that I trust you, that I'm not afraid anymore." "You don't have to stop being afraid," Clara said, echoing her own words from months ago. "You just have to be afraid and choose me anyway." "I do," Ethan said. "I choose you. Today, tomorrow, every day I have left. I choose you, Clara. Always." She leaned down and kissed him, gentle and careful, and when she pulled back, both of them were crying. "Rest now," she said. "Recover. Get strong. And when you're well enough, we're going to have a very long conversation about how we make sure this never happens again." "Looking forward to it," Ethan said, and despite everything, he smiled. He slept then, truly slept, and Clara finally allowed herself to believe he would survive. She stayed beside him, holding his hand, choosing to forgive even though the anger and fear were still raw. Because that's what love meant. Choosing each other not just in the easy moments, but in the hard ones. Not just when everything was perfect, but when everything was broken and painful and terrifying. Ethan had nearly died rather than face his fear of vulnerability. But he'd survived, and in surviving, he'd learned the lesson that had eluded him for so long. Love wasn't the danger, fear was. And the only cure for fear was the courage to love anyway, fully and completely, without reservation or retreat. It would take time for him to fully heal, physically from the hypothermia, emotionally from the wounds that had driven him into the storm. But Clara would be there for all of it, because she'd made her choice long ago. She'd chosen Ethan Hale, stubborn and afraid and learning to love, and she'd keep choosing him every day until he finally believed he was worth choosing. That was what partnership meant. That was what love required. And Clara had enough strength for both of them until Ethan found his own again. Ethan's recovery was slow and humbling in ways he'd never anticipated. For a man who'd built his entire identity around self-reliance and physical strength, Being confined to bed for a week was its own kind of torture. His fingers and toes had suffered frostbite, requiring careful treatment to prevent permanent damage. His lungs ached from breathing frozen air for too long. And worst of all, he was completely dependent on Clara for everything from meals to basic care. She tended to him with efficiency that bordered on severity those first few days, her movements precise and her words minimal. Ethan could feel her anger simmering beneath the surface, held in check only by the fact that he was still recovering. She changed his bandages, brought him food, helped him when his weakened body required it, but the warmth that usually existed between them was notably absent. On the 5th day, when he was strong enough to sit up without assistance and his extremities had regained most of their feeling, Clara finally spoke what had been building since the night she'd found him half frozen in the snow. "We need to talk," she said, setting down the breakfast tray with more force than necessary. "I know," Ethan said quietly. Clara sat in the chair beside the bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her expression carefully controlled. "You almost died, Ethan. You almost left me a widow after 6 months of marriage because you were too proud or too afraid to listen when I told you to wait, to take precautions, to let other people help." "I know," he said again. "Do you?" Her voice cracked slightly, the anger giving way to the pain beneath it. "Do you really understand what it was like for me? Watching you ride out into deadly conditions against my advice, waiting as the sun set and you didn't return, searching in the darkness knowing that every minute could be the difference between finding you alive or dead? Do you understand that I had to wrap my own body around yours to keep you warm while I waited for help, not knowing if you'd survive, praying to anything that would listen, that I wouldn't lose you?" Tears were streaming down her face now, and Ethan felt his own throat tighten with emotion. "I'm so sorry, Clara. I don't want your apologies," she interrupted, her voice fierce. "I want to understand why. Why you would risk everything we've built, everything we have, for cattle that could have waited another day. Why you would choose to prove your independence over trusting my judgment. Why you would rather die alone in the snow than admit you need me." The questions hung in the air, demanding real answers, not the easy excuses he'd been offering himself for months. Ethan took a long breath, feeling the ache in his chest that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. "Because I was terrified," he said finally. "Because every day I wake up next to you, every time I realize how much I love you, how much I need you, I can feel the potential for loss growing. And I learned a long time ago that the only way to survive loss is to never let anyone get close enough to destroy you when they leave." "But I'm not leaving," Clara said, her voice breaking. "I know that here." Ethan touched his head. "And even here," he touched his heart. "But there's some part of me that's still that kid whose mother died and whose father gave up, who learned that depending on people meant pain. And when I feel that fear getting too strong, I pull back. I create distance. I do stupid, reckless things that let me feel like I'm in control, like I'm strong, like I don't need anyone." "Even if those things kill you?" "I wasn't thinking that far ahead," Ethan admitted. "I was just thinking that if I could focus on the ranch work, on being the tough rancher who handles everything alone, then I wouldn't have to face how scared I am of losing you." Clara was quiet for a long moment, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me. It's the truth. All of it." Ethan reached for her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she let him take it. "Clara, I almost died out there, and my last conscious thought was that I'd wasted so much time being afraid. Time I could have spent loving you completely, trusting you fully, being the partner you deserved. I realized that by trying to protect myself from potential future pain, I was creating actual present pain for both of us. And that was worse than any loss I was afraid of." "So what changed?" Clara asked. "What's different now?" "Because I finally understand that the thing I was most afraid of, losing you, was exactly what I was causing by pulling away. If I died out there, it wouldn't have been fate or bad luck or unavoidable tragedy. It would have been my own fear killing me and destroying us in the process." Ethan's grip on her hand tightened. "I don't want to live like that anymore, Clara. I don't want to waste whatever time we have together being afraid. I want to love you without reservation, trust you without hesitation, and build a life that's about us instead of about protecting myself from you."
Clara studied his face for a long moment, searching for something. Finally, she seemed to find it. "You scared me so badly," she whispered. "When I thought I'd lost you, when I didn't know if you'd survive, I realized that being angry at you for being afraid was pointless." "We're both afraid, Ethan."
I'm terrified every day that I'm not good enough, that I'll fail at this ranching life, that you'll wake up and realize you married a city woman who doesn't really belong here. But I choose you anyway, despite that fear. That's what I need from you. Not perfection, not fearlessness, just the willingness to choose me, despite the fear. "I do choose you," Ethan said. "I will choose you. Every day, for the rest of my life. And when the fear gets loud, when I start pulling back out of old habit, I need you to call me on it. Don't let me retreat. Don't let me use work or pride or stubbornness as excuses to avoid vulnerability. Make me face it. Make me talk about it. Make me choose you over the fear." "I can do that," Clara said. "But you have to promise me something in return." "Anything. Promise me you'll value your life as much as I do. Promise me you won't take unnecessary risks just to prove you're strong or independent or capable. Promise me that when I'm worried about your safety, you'll listen instead of dismissing my concerns as overprotection." Her voice was steady but intense. "I can live with fear, Ethan. I can live with uncertainty and hard times and all the challenges this territory throws at us. But I can't live wondering if each time you ride out is the last time I'll see you alive." "I promise," Ethan said without hesitation. "No more stupid risks, no more prioritizing cattle over my own safety, no more making decisions that affect both of us without consulting you first." Clara nodded, and some of the tension finally left her shoulders. "Then we'll get through this. We'll heal, both of us, and we'll be stronger for it." She leaned in and kissed him, and this time there was forgiveness in it, and hope, and the bone-deep relief of two people who'd faced the possibility of losing each other and chosen to hold on tighter instead of letting go. Recovery continued over the following weeks. As Ethan regained his strength, he threw himself into being the partner Clara deserved, not through grand gestures, but through the small daily choices that built trust. He consulted her on every decision, shared his worries instead of hiding them, and when he felt the old urge to retreat or create distance, he forced himself to move closer instead. It wasn't easy. Old patterns died hard, and there were moments when his instinct was still to handle things alone, to prove he didn't need help, to protect himself through self-reliance. But each time he remembered the feeling of dying in the snow, the regret that had consumed his last conscious moments, and he made the harder choice to stay present, stay vulnerable, stay connected. Clara noticed the changes and rewarded them not with praise but with deeper trust. She shared more of her own fears, about failing, about not being enough, about the isolation sometimes weighing on her despite her earlier claims to enjoy solitude. They learned to hold each other's fears without trying to fix them, to offer comfort without minimizing, to be present in both the good moments and the hard ones. Spring came late that year, the snow lingering well into March before finally surrendering to warmer temperatures. When the world finally thawed, revealing brown grass and muddy earth, Ethan and Clara walked the property together, assessing winter damage and planning for the season ahead. They'd lost fewer cattle than expected despite the brutal storm, a testament to the preparation Clara had insisted on and the sheltered valleys Ethan knew how to utilize. The ranch buildings had all survived intact, and the spring calves born in the warming weather were healthy and thriving. "We should expand," Clara said, studying the eastern pasture that Ethan had always considered too remote to be useful. "If we extend the fencing and develop a water source, we could run another 50 head out here easily." "That's ambitious," Ethan said, but he was smiling. "But I like it. We'd need to hire more permanent hands, build another line shack for shelter during roundups." "We can afford it now," Clara said, pulling out the small notebook where she tracked finances. "The improved record-keeping and loss prevention from the security measures saved us enough over the winter to fund expansion, and if we're smart about it, we could double our operation in 2 years." They spent an hour discussing plans, both of them contributing ideas, challenging each other's assumptions, building something together that was bigger than what either could have created alone. It was the kind of partnership Ethan had thought impossible 6 months ago. Two people with different strengths working toward a common goal, neither trying to dominate or control, both genuinely invested in the other's ideas. When they finally headed back to the house,
Ethan stopped at the cairn marking the property line and looked out over the land that had once been his entire world. "I thought this ranch was everything," he said quietly. "I thought if I could just build it, prove I could make it work alone, that would be enough. That would prove I was strong, that I didn't need anyone." "And now?" Clara asked. "Now I realized the ranch was never what I was really building. It was just the excuse, the distraction, the way to avoid dealing with the fact that I was lonely and afraid and desperately trying to convince myself that isolation was strength." He turned to face her. "You changed everything, Clara. You showed me that partnership isn't weakness, that vulnerability isn't failure, that love is the bravest thing we can choose." Clara's eyes were bright with emotion. "You changed me, too. I came here thinking I needed to prove I could be independent, that I could survive without needing anyone.
But you taught me that choosing to need someone, choosing to build a life together, is actually stronger than going it alone."
"We're quite a pair," Ethan said with a slight smile.
"Two people terrified of connection who somehow found each other and built something worth fighting for."
"The best partnerships are forged in fire," Clara said. "We had ours. We survived it. Now we get to enjoy what we built." That night, lying in bed with Clara curled against his side, Ethan reflected on the journey that had brought them here. 6 months ago, he'd stood on his porch listening to a judge tell him to marry or lose his land, and he'd seen it as a threat, an ultimatum, an injustice. He'd approached Clara as a solution to a problem, a legal necessity, nothing more. And yet she'd become everything, his partner in every sense of the word, his best friend, his greatest advocate and his most honest critic. The person who'd seen through his defenses and loved him anyway. The person who'd literally saved his life when his own fear almost killed him. "Clara?" he said softly. "Hmm?" She was half asleep, her voice drowsy and content. "Thank you." "For what?" "For not giving up on me. For seeing something worth fighting for even when I was too afraid to see it myself. For saving my life in every way that matters." Clara shifted, propping herself up to look at him in the moonlight filtering through the window. "You saved mine too, you know. I was so lost when I came here. No purpose, no place, no real hope. You gave me all of that. You gave me a home, a partnership, a reason to believe I could be more than what everyone back east told me I was limited to being." "We saved each other then," Ethan said. "We did," Clara agreed. "And we'll keep saving each other, every day, in all the small ways that build a life together." She kissed him and settled back against his chest, and they drifted toward sleep together. Two people who'd found in each other the strength to be vulnerable, the courage to love without guarantees, and the partnership that had transformed them both. The months that followed were the most productive and profitable in Iron Creek Ranch's history. With Clara managing the business operations and Ethan handling the physical work, they created a system that maximized efficiency while minimizing losses. They expanded carefully, adding acreage and livestock at a sustainable pace. They built relationships with other ranchers, sharing information about rustling threats and market conditions, creating a network of mutual support that benefited everyone. By summer's end, the ranch employed 8 permanent hands plus seasonal workers during roundups. The cattle operation had grown to over 400 head, and the ranch house itself had been expanded, a new wing with 2 additional bedrooms, because Clara was pregnant and they'd already started talking about the family they wanted to build. The news of Clara's pregnancy had brought Ethan to his knees with joy and terror in equal measure. Another person to love meant another person he could lose, another vulnerability, another risk. But this time, instead of pulling away, he'd pulled Clara closer, sharing his fears honestly and letting her reassure him that they would face parenthood the same way they'd faced everything else, together. "You're going to be an amazing father," Clara told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Her hand rested on the small swell of her belly where their child grew. "How do you know?" Ethan asked. "I don't know anything about being a parent. My own father was a cautionary tale." "You know how to love," Clara said simply. "You know how to show up, how to work hard, how to admit when you're wrong and try to do better. You know how to be vulnerable and brave at the same time. That's everything that matters." Ethan put his hand over hers on her belly, feeling the miracle of new life they'd created together. "I'm still scared," he admitted. "So am I," Clara said. "But
We're scared together, and that makes all the difference. The baby arrived in early spring, a daughter with Clara's gray-green eyes and Ethan's dark hair, perfectly healthy and impossibly tiny. They named her Sarah, after Ethan's mother, and when he held her for the first time, something fundamental shifted in his understanding of what love meant. This tiny person, completely dependent and utterly trusting, demanded everything from him: his time, his attention, his protection, his heart. There was no way to love her partially, no way to hold something back in case of loss, no way to maintain the kind of emotional distance he'd spent years perfecting. She required total vulnerability, complete commitment, absolute trust that love was worth the terrifying risk, and Ethan gave it willingly. The years that followed brought more children: a son named James 2 years after Sarah, then twin girls, Emma and Grace, 3 years after that. The ranch house expanded again to accommodate the growing family, and the sounds of children's laughter filled spaces that had once known only silence. Ethan discovered that fatherhood was simultaneously the most terrifying and most rewarding experience of his life. Every scraped knee, every fever, every moment when one of his children was out of sight sent panic through his chest, the old fear of loss trying to resurface. But Clara was always there, steady and calm, reminding him that fear was normal but couldn't be allowed to paralyze. The children needed protection, but also freedom, that love meant letting go as much as holding on. He learned to balance those competing needs, to be present without being overprotective, to guide without controlling. He taught his children to ride, to work with cattle, to respect the land that would someday be theirs. And Clara taught them to read and calculate, to question and think independently, to value partnership over dominance and cooperation over competition. Together, they raised children who were strong and kind, independent and loving, capable of both vulnerability and courage. Everything Ethan and Clara had learned to be through the crucible of their own relationship. One evening, 15 years after that forced marriage in Reverend Calloway's office, Ethan stood on the porch of Iron Creek Ranch watching his children play in the yard. Sarah was 14 now, helping her younger brother with his reading. James was 12, already showing signs of becoming the kind of rancher his father was. The twins were 9, chasing each other around the garden. Clara had expanded into something that supplied vegetables for their whole family and several neighboring ranches besides. Clara came out to join him, sliding under his arm in the easy intimacy of long partnership. Her hair was streaked with gray now, her hands weathered from years of work, her face marked with laugh lines and sun exposure. She was more beautiful to him at 41 than she'd been at 26. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how wrong I was," Ethan said. "About everything I believed before you came into my life." "Tell me." "I thought strength meant being alone. I thought vulnerability was weakness. I thought love was the most dangerous thing I could allow myself, the biggest risk, the greatest threat to my survival." He tightened his arm around her. "I was so focused on protecting my land that I didn't realize the land was never what needed saving." "What needed saving?" Clara asked, though she knew the answer. "My heart," Ethan said simply. "My capacity to love, to trust, to believe that something good could last. You saved all of that, Clara. You walked into my fortress and convinced me to tear down the walls. You showed me that the thing I was most afraid of, depending on someone, loving someone, building a life with someone, was actually the only thing that could make life worth living." Clara leaned her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "You saved me too, remember? I was so angry at the world, so determined to prove I didn't need anyone, so convinced that independence was the only thing worth fighting for. You taught me that partnership isn't giving up independence. It's choosing to share strength instead of carrying everything alone." They watched their children play as the sun set over the ranch that had grown from 600 acres to over 2,000, from one stubborn man to a thriving family operation. The Iron Creek Ranch was successful by any measure, profitable, well-managed, respected throughout the territory. But its success wasn't measured in cattle or acreage or financial returns. Its success was measured in the family it supported, the partnership at its foundation, the love that filled every building and pasture and fence line. It was measured in children who knew they were cherished, in hands who were treated with dignity and respect, in neighbors who could count on help when they needed it. "Do you ever regret it?" Ethan asked, the question he'd been afraid to ask for 15 years. Do you ever wish you'd gotten back on that stage to Philadelphia and found a different life? Clara turned to look at him, her expression tender. Not once. Not for a single moment. This life, this ranch, this family, you. It's everything I never knew I needed. Everything I never let myself hope for because it seemed too good to be possible. Even when it's hard, even during the bad years, the storms, the losses, the times when we fight and hurt each other? Especially then, Clara said, because those are the moments that prove what we have is real, that our partnership can survive difficulty, that our love is strong enough to weather anything. Anyone can be together when things are easy. We've proven we can be together when things are impossible, and we come out stronger every time. Ethan kissed her, long and deep, a kiss that held 15 years of partnership and growth and learning to love without fear. When they pulled apart, Sarah was watching them with the expression of amused tolerance that teenagers reserve for their parents' displays of affection. You two are embarrassing, she called out. Good, Ethan called back. That's our job. The children's laughter carried across the yard, and Clara smiled. We did well, she said softly. Look at what we built from that desperate arrangement, that marriage of necessity. We built everything, Ethan agreed. We built a ranch, a family, a life. But more than that, we built proof that love is stronger than fear, that partnership is stronger than pride, that choosing each other every day can transform everything. As darkness fell and the family moved inside for dinner, Ethan took one last look at the land that had once been his entire world. It was still beautiful, still valuable, still the result of years of hard work and determination. But it wasn't what mattered most anymore. What mattered was the woman beside him who taught him to be brave. What mattered was the children whose existence proved that love could overcome fear. What mattered was the partnership that had started as legal obligation and become the strongest foundation anyone could build a life upon. The judge had forced him to marry or lose his ranch. He'd married to save the land. But in the end, what he'd saved wasn't the ranch at all. What he'd saved was his own capacity to love, to trust, to believe that happiness was possible if he was brave enough to risk his heart. What he'd saved was his future, his family, every good thing that had come from choosing vulnerability over safety, partnership over isolation, love over fear. And the greatest irony of all was that the woman forced into his life by law had become the person he chose every single day by love, freely, completely, without reservation or regret. Clara Whitfield had walked onto his porch, an unwanted solution to an unwelcome problem, and she'd walked away with his heart so completely that he couldn't remember what life had felt like before she owned it. She'd saved him from loneliness, from fear, from a life half-lived in service to protection rather than purpose. She'd given him partnership, family, joy, and the courage to believe that love was worth every terrifying risk. And in return, he'd given her the same, a home, a purpose, a partnership built on mutual respect and hard-won trust, and the knowledge that she would never again be dismissed as too old, too independent, too anything to be valued exactly as she was. Together, they'd built something that would outlast them both, not just in the ranch that would pass to their children, but in the example they'd set of what marriage could be when two people chose each other, not despite their fears, but because they were brave enough to face those fears together. That was the legacy of Iron Creek Ranch. Not the cattle or the land or the buildings, but the proof that love conquered fear, that partnership trumped pride, and that sometimes the best things in life came from accepting the help we didn't know we needed from the people we didn't know we were waiting for. Ethan Hale had fought to protect his land and ended up saving his heart, and Clara Whitfield had come west looking for independence and found instead the greatest partnership of her life. They'd both gotten more than they'd bargained for. They'd both become more than they'd thought possible, and they'd both learned that the thing they'd feared most, needing someone, depending on someone, loving someone, was actually the thing that made them strongest. That was the truth that carried them through 15 years of marriage and would carry them through 50 more. That was the foundation that supported everything they'd built and everything they would become. And that was the story of how a forced marriage became the truest love story the Arizona Territory had ever known, not because it was easy or perfect or free from struggle, but because two stubborn, frightened people chose to be brave enough to love each other anyway. The end of their beginning and the beginning of everything that mattered.